Welcome back, movie lovers. Thank you for coming to another episode on John Webster Film. I'm your host, John Webster. Amy is off this week, but I'm joined by a very special guest today, Mr. Doug Adams, who is, I would have to say, probably the authority on all things music for The Lord of the Rings. Doug, why don't you introduce yourself and just tell everybody a bit about yourself?
Okay, sure. So yeah, thanks for having me on. This is kind of cool. I don't think I've done a live YouTube thing with this interface before, so it was a learning experience for me. So yeah, I'm Doug Adams. I'm the author of we did this book on all the music of the Lord of the Rings films, and it was something that there it is now. Yes, exactly. It was something that we worked on during the production of the film. So I was very lucky to be able to work kind of side by side with Howard Shore and his crew, and then as the time progressed, kind of earned the trust of the studio and the producers and Peter Jackson and all that sort of thing. So I was able to hang out with them a little bit and kind of pick everybody's minds. And this was very, very early on in my musical life, so it was kind of an eye opener, to be sure, as they say. But it kind of a lot of people like to say that the Lord of the Rings stuff, it changed our life and it changed our outlook and things like that. And I don't doubt any of that. I think people are quite sincere about that. And I can definitely count myself among those names because it put me on a totally different trajectory in my life. So it was kind of great.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm going to get the sort of fanboying out of the way at first. I've had your book on my shelf for the past 10 years ever since it came out, and it honestly is a jewel in my collection. Obviously, I think anybody who knows me knows I'm obsessed with the Lord of the Rings, the films, and the music. I've just we were talking just a couple minutes ago that I can pretty much listen to the music nonstop. It's an element of the films that never gets old for me, and your book is an incredible study of that music. So thank you.
Yeah. It's shocking to me that it's been out for as long as it has now. We hit the 10th anniversary just this past fall, and in fact, I got an email from someone. So we released the book first in London and kind of let it spread across Europe for a week or so. I think the sales went live there, and then we released it in the US shortly thereafter. But I got a note from someone in Tasmania who had come to London for the initial book release, where Howard and I did an event at a music shop in London. And he was the person that bought the very first book. And so he was sending me on the 10th anniversary, sending me pictures of the book still on the shelf in Tasmania. Which I found incredibly honored, and really cool. This is the very first one that sold. But yeah, this thing's been around for a while. We're in the 6th printing now, I think. And it's, as you and I kind of chatted about beforehand, Lord of the Rings is one of those things, it's a true evergreen property. There is always some age of people that are coming to it for the first time, whether it's the books or the films or the music or all of the above. There is always somebody discovering these things. And that's been one of the great bits of fun for me is that, I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot of times because I'll make the same, hey, did you ever notice in the Ring theme, blah, blah, blah. But there's always somebody discovering these things. And everybody feels an incredible personal connection to them. Every place I've gone in the world, and we've done a fair amount of traveling with these things. Everybody feels that these books are about them, or these scores are about them, or that Tolkien really had them in mind when he created the Hobbits. It's this universal thing, and it doesn't seem like it will maybe ever stop people's interest in these stories and the way that these stories have been told by these master storytellers, be them filmmakers or musicians, of course. It just always attracts people's attention and people's passion. So it's more than a great stroke of luck to be associated with any of these things. It's just beyond brilliant. I love it.
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to save the concert stuff for later on. I just have to mention, because you talk about it being a generational thing. And I remember two things, especially from going to that New York concert in 2009. I remember sitting down in the audience and there being a bunch of little kids
Yeah.
nearby, and many of them were seeing it for the first time.
Right.
At that concert. And also, I remember going into the Radio City Music Hall, and there were a bunch of kids going in who were part of, I believe, either the chorus or they were part of the orchestra, and they just it turned to me. One of them was a little girl, and she was like, "Are you here to see Lord of the Rings? I'm playing in that."
That's great. Yeah.
Well,
that's great because the little kids that were at that, so the Fellowship of the Ring was already almost 10 years old at that point. So it's these kids that have grown up with these films and with a passion for music are now the ones coming back around and performing in these groups. And there's a lot of professional musicians out there now in a lot of wonderful ensembles that started that journey because they heard these scores. So that's like, that's an amazing cyclical thing that this music has pushed the next generation to continue creating it. I guess that's how you get standards. That's how the music of the great masters lives on, because it's always reinventing itself in that way. So it's kind of cool to see Howard Shore in that same tradition, as well he deserves to be.
Absolutely. I just want to go ahead and take a minute to say hello to a lot of the people in the chat. I've seen a lot of familiar names, so thank you guys as always for coming. I see my brother Stephen Stark, Here Be Dragons, and thank you, man. Which, by the way, guys, be sure to tune in to Here Be Dragons tomorrow, because my usual co-host Amy Blackfire will be a guest on the channel. Stephen will be doing an episode of I Know That Nerd, and she'll be interviewed, so you don't want to miss that. I want to say hello to Erin M, who is maybe equally as excited about this stream as I am. She sent me a number of questions, Doug, which we'll get to
okay.
in due course. But her and I sort of famously don't agree on a lot at all, except we both love Lord of the Rings and we both love film scores.
There you go. Great equalizer.
I see Danny McKay, Jess, Lady Leaf, Sanri, thanks for coming. Micah, Beth, thank you guys so much. And and I do see
Hey, Ryan. That's a official Shore family member. Hi, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
Wonderful composer in his own right. You can hear Ryan's music all over the place these days. He's incredibly busy. So, hi, Ryan.
This is an honor. Thank you. And I'm looking at, somebody told me not to look at the numbers in here. I see we've got, going on 50 people in here, which I'm blown away by. Thank you guys for all coming up. I see Kelly's here too. You guys, Bernie, I love all you guys. You guys are my family. Okay, so let's go ahead and first, I kind of want to just start off, like, how did all this start for you? Did you love film music from a young age, or what was it that sparked your interest?
I did, actually. I mean, I was drawn to music from a very young age. I was one of those little kids that started piano lessons at like 4 years old. I did, Little League and all these other things too, and was remarkably awful at all of them. So drawn to music by default is something that I wasn't horrifyingly bad at.
I can't identify with that at all.
Yeah, well, I tried. I give it an effort. I grew up in the Star Wars generation, and so I think that was probably some of the first place that I heard orchestral music was in films and film scores and things like that. So when I was very little, my father had gone out to get me, the LP. I used to have explained, this is how long I've been telling these stories. There was a while in there where I had to explain what like vinyl was, and now it's like popular again. So I don't have to explain to anybody what a record is. But he went to go get me The Story of The Empire Strikes Back. They would do some of the dialogue, and a narrator would come in and tell you what was happening if it was something visual. And he went out to get me these records and accidentally got me the John Williams score, the wonderful London Symphony Orchestra performance. And I put it on to play it and kept thinking, like, when does Luke show up? What's going on? And the music kept going and going and going. And I was completely transfixed by it. And so then my dad took it and realized he'd gotten the wrong thing and said, well, I'll take it back. I'll get the right thing. And I said, no. I like this. Keep this. Let's get more like this, in fact. And that it led to a great passion for orchestral music and kind of, I was never really much of a pop music kid. I have a great love for jazz and world musics and things like that. But I wasn't really a kid that listened to a lot of rock and roll and things like that. A bit here and there, like everybody does. But that was really what I was interested in. So because of that, I make my living as a musician. I went into music. All of my studies are in music, despite the fact that I did this book. I'm not a writer by trade. I'm a musician by trade. So I think it was sort of my entrance to this larger world was the music from films, which of course is largely written especially in that time, in the kind of late 70s, early 80s. It was a late romantic sound of the the late 1800s, early 1900s, that kind of where tonal language is beginning to stretch at the seams a little bit, but still had that kind of flow and shape and big, beautiful, expressive power to it. So that's always been part of my musical DNA. And I've always taken it very seriously, and I've always been very frustrated to see when it's sort of thrown into the gutter and seen as this lesser effort, because how dare it be created in a compromised situation where perhaps a director might have a say over what happens. And it's hugely inaccurate from a musical standpoint, because things have always been created by composers working with other people, insofar as somebody is paying for these things, or perhaps there's a stagecraft involved. I always like to tell the story that in the last opera from Wagner's Ring Cycle, he had to write some extra music because some of the stuff couldn't move across, a piece of the set couldn't move across the stage quickly enough. So even the great Wagner had to do some rewrites based on just simple logistics and that kind of very basic nonsense. But that's where these things come from, and so it became very important to me as a musician to show these connections between what are the mandates of film music and what are the mandates of music throughout history, and hopefully to get it taken a little bit more seriously. When I was a student in music school, I originally went in and was trying to write research papers on film music and things like that because of this particular passion of mine. And there was so little work on film music in terms of serious academic stuff, but even journalistic stuff. A lot of it was just off the cuff little capsule record reviews and stuff. It's got a catchy tune, but the album's a little bit long, and I think there was a flute in there at some point. Like this is the kind of deep thinking that film music was being given. So I think it was always, that's how I began writing for magazines on film music and things like that, because I wanted to try to show, no, wait, there is great thought and great artistry happening here, but just nobody's talking about it. We kind of look at it too quickly. You could write a capsule review of a Haydn string quartet, it was kind of witty and the last movement was quick. Like, okay, well, that doesn't really help you very much. So I thought it would be important that somebody come and take a deeper look at these things. And that's kind of how I first came into contact with Howard Shore. I was writing for a magazine on film and television music, Film Score Monthly, if anybody remembers that from back in the day. They're still around. They're online now. And so I'd interviewed Howard many different times on many different scores. And we'd always gotten along very well. And when Lord of the Rings came along, he just sort of said, well, you want to do something on this? And, yeah.
You're describing my dream scenario.
It was hugely surreal, because it still is my dream. I mean, I'm still living it, but it was very nebulous. We didn't really know what we wanted to do. He had seen that, it was very early in his process. He was going down to New Zealand and he saw these people, doing this incredible, art level work, very high-minded, very carefully created, very passionate artisans working with their hands and making chainmail link by link and doing this incredible work on the swords and training horses and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody knows what went into making these massive movies. And I think he thought it might be cool to have someone who was focusing on the score a little bit, to just sort of, we didn't really know what it would be. And frankly, it was in my, wildest imaginations, I thought, well, maybe I'll get to do a paragraph on the CD or something like that. And as time went by and these scores became, I don't want to say complicated because that makes it seem like they're somehow thorny and hard to listen to, but they became very intricate and very thoughtful and incredibly tied to the narrative. And as we know, this is a very involved narrative, so the scores became equally as involved. And it seemed like the only way to really explain what we felt we wanted to explain about them was to put it in a book form. Which, of course, I was fresh out of grad school at this point. I should mention I was really quite young. So, are you cutting me off? Is that Bernie telling me to clam up?
Well, no, she was just saying just a paragraph, as if the music could be encapsulated.
That was what I thought, and I stayed up all night. The night that I had spoken to Howard about that originally. My mind reeling over this potential paragraph. Oh, this is going to be the greatest paragraph ever written on film scores ever. And then the kind of access that they gave me. I was reading something on the internet the other day about all-time tearjerker moments in films where just no matter how many times you watch them, you well up. And one of the scenes that came up in everybody's list was the you bow to no one thing. And as you listen to the you bow to no one at the end of Return of the King, I'm sitting in that orchestra as they're playing that. I'm not doing anything. I'm absorbing my little acoustic pocket, but that's about all I could do. But I'm in the orchestra, and I can remember even watching that. This was months before the film was due to come out. The special effects weren't finished. It was, you could see a grip walking by in the background with this kind of half composited shot. But I think I knew then, whoa, this might never go away. This is too good for anyone to ever ignore. But that's something that's up there with, the opening shot from Star Wars, and we're not in Kansas anymore, and just things that are always these cultural touchstones that maybe will never go away. So to be able to think, I'm sitting in that, I'm right there. It's crazy to me. I'll often go on these things and people say well, what's your favorite theme from Lord of the Rings? Or, what's your favorite passage or scene or whatever like that? And it's very hard to say because these are all personal memories to me. It's not watching somebody else's adventure. It's watching the adventure that I was on at the time too, and all the things that happen when you're a younger person in your life. And this is when I met my future wife, and this is the first time I was ever on a plane by myself, and this is the first time I was out of the country by myself, and this is where I lost my passport. It's all these things are very, very personal things. So that's why I'm even way down the road here. I'm always thrilled to be able to talk about these things because it's such it's a wonderful trip down memory lane. You get to revisit Middle Earth, but you get to sort of revisit your own personal history at the same time. And it's a nice, comforting place to be.
I feel I feel that way just as having been an audience member. But then you talk about, sitting in the orchestra while these moments were being recorded, and being that close to the actual film production. That's got to be just on a whole nother layer. But I think that these movies just felt that way to a lot of the people who were immersed in them, while they were out. I was watching Fellowship of the Ring the other day, and just I got goosebumps when Frodo and Sam start walking down into the Emyn Muil, and the Shire hymn starts up over the end credits, and I remember that feeling of knowing there was a year until the next film, but it felt like this exciting journey that I was on, and that time kind of stretches out for me. So again, I can't even imagine being part, of that experience from the inside and going on that trip.
Yeah, it was a stroke of luck, the likes of which I will never see again in my life, because it was very, very wild. But yeah, to be able to see genius up that close, that face to face with it, and these people who were just somehow they were all hitting their stride at the exact right moment. And by the time of the Return of the King, there was never ego involved with any of these things. Nobody was ever like, "Hey, watch this! I'm going to be so great." It was everybody was just incredibly passionate about what they were doing. But by the time of the Return of the King, they had a sense that these things were enormously popular already. As you say, that year wait, it felt very sort of stretched out. I don't know. Like it felt like it took longer to get these things out into the world. I mean, these days with the Marvel films, like they're coming out all the time, that year long between those things, it just felt like we were in the era of the Lord of the Rings films for a long time. But by the Return of the King, they kind of knew that they were working on a legacy project. And it was amazing to be able to see people that maybe had an understanding of what the history of these films was going to, and these scores, of course, I should say, but what it was going to be like. They knew that these things had somehow tapped into a collective consciousness and were hitting people. So it was just wonderful, and everyone was so grateful. Nobody there was egotistical about it. It was just they were so happy that they had been able to connect with people. So to see that sort of that enthusiasm and that sincerity, it's hard not to be inspired.
Yeah, and I feel like, I don't know, I feel like those feelings and those emotions sort of trickled down to the audience, because I remember like watching the documentaries every year when those DVDs came out, and it did kind of feel like going along on that journey with the production, and it's nice to hear that it kind of, because you figure documentaries and stuff are put together to evoke certain feelings and emotions, but it's reassuring to hear that it felt that way.
Sure.
On the inside.
Yeah. No, those documentaries were not manipulative in that way. They were very honest. There was that level of connection and family, and it was a lot of people that nobody there was sort of a lifer. Like nobody had done this sort of a project before. The actors were all sort of new to this sort of filmmaking. I guess Sean Astin had done some really big films in the 80s, but this was a different type of thing. Howard Shore hadn't scored this type of film before. Peter Jackson hadn't directed this type of film before. So everybody was just, very in the moment. It was not business as usual for anyone. They were all fully engaged and thinking like, they knew to save their memories. They knew that this was important, and they were right.
I have to say, because you talked about when, as the project was evolving, when you started off thinking you might write a paragraph for it, and then, of course, it turned into a book. When things started to shift, and you realized what you guys would be, putting out, like, what did that feel like as the gears were sort of turning in your head?
The very first traveling I did with this thing, like I said, it took me a while to sort of gain the trust of the studios and everybody, because there was just this weird kid that kept hanging around asking questions about the music, and it took them a while to kind of figure out who the heck I even was. And I don't blame them. I mean, they were busy. So I would always go out to New York. Howard and I began discussions on this on the phone, and kind of the first thing he said to me was like, well, why don't you come out to my offices in New York, and we'll maybe start looking at some of the scores. And this was back in the day when nobody was publishing printed engraved film scores or anything like that. So it was amazing to be able to see written film music. You never saw that sort of thing. But I would always travel out there with my dad. Like I said, this was very young in my life, and I thought, well, maybe Dad can come out and run around New York, and I'll go do my work at Howard's office and all that sort of thing. And I don't remember exactly where we were in the process necessarily, but I would go on these trips, and I would come home and type everything out and just sort of collect my thoughts and the notes that I had made, and I'd gone through the scores and written down passages and things like that. And I started compiling everything, and it was a lot. It was pages and pages of this stuff. And it started to look like a book to me. So I went in and just like very early, well, not that early, but early enough, Microsoft Word and things like that. And I would drag in sketched out musical passages, and I found some of the imagery on the internet and put pictures of, if it was talking about these characters, I put the characters next to it. I even downloaded, I got in trouble for this one. I downloaded some fonts of like Tolkien languages, and I would just hit random keys and put, the Tolkien's runes around the book. And eventually when I had to turn over all these pages to the guy that did all the translations for the film, put everything into Elvish and Dwarvish and Khuzdul and all that, he sent me a note saying, "What is all this nonsense on the edges of your pages? It's just a bunch of gobbledygook in Tolkien letters." I said, I don't know any of these things. I was just hitting like the H key. I would write things like "publish my book," and I would put it in like Elvish font just to amuse myself. And yeah, so he yelled at me for disrespecting Tolkien's work, which I did not mean to do. But anyways, I took all this stuff and I printed it and probably used about nine ink cartridges to make it happen. And I gave it to Howard and said, this is what I've got at this point. It kind of looks like a book, I guess, right? And he nodded. It does look like that. And so I said, well, what do you think? Is that what we should kind of pursue this is? Does it seem like should we do a book? And Howard's wonderful because he's undaunted by anything. I mean, this guy has so many wonderful experiences in his life. So he just said, yeah, let's do a book. And I can remember coming back to the hotel that night. My dad was there, of course, and telling him, I think I'm doing a book. Because, he was always up for a nice little little trip out to New York, but he kind of never, like, what is exactly it that you're working on? So it felt kind of neat to be able to say, I think we're writing a book. I think this is going to be a book. And lo and behold, it eventually became a book. It still took a lot more work. I don't think they'd even composed Return of the King by that point. But by then we knew, that's what it was. And so when I went to England for the recording sessions for the Return of the King, I was able to have my little CD-ROMs of the PDF or whatever, and say, here, this is what we have. It's going to be a book. It's going to be a book. And it certainly made it much easier to describe to people what the heck this weird little kid was hanging around the background of the, sneaking his way around the cello section sometimes. So, he's doing a book. It's okay. Yeah. I mean, they were so friendly and so nice to me. Dermot McCrean, the fiddle player that played all the solos for Hobbiton and the fiddle theme, the Hardinger theme for Rohan. We got stuck in the same car getting a ride home one night from the recording sessions, and just on the way home, oh, do you fancy a pint? Let's go stop at my daughter's a barkeep here. So everybody was just more than happy to, I guess once you have Howard Shore's approval for anything, people start to respect you. He's a great calling card for people suddenly thinking that you're more legit than you feel like you really are. But everybody was very friendly and kind of took me right into the family, and it was amazing.
Sorry, you say the stuff, and I'm just picturing. It's I think as someone who loves music so much and kind of feels always like they're a little bit of the intruder, I can just picture myself just kind of creeping along like, don't mind me. Here,
come back to Harvard, because by the time we finally got everything really up and rolling, you have to wait until everything's done, right? You can't publish the music, and people would always say, well, when was it come out? Well, you guys have to finish making the music. I can't put this book out until you're done. So by that time, Lord of the Rings was well on its way. Like when you were at those concerts in New York in 2009, we didn't have the book out yet. It wasn't until 2010. So it had been long enough that this thing was a stone cold classic by that point. And we kind of felt like, well, this book is going to be the capstone and everything. This is the last statement on not only the music of the Lord of the Rings, but kind of the whole Lord of the Rings phenomenon. It's the last thing that we're going to release from the initial push.
Or is it?
Well, for our part of the thing. But it made me feel like, man, if I screw this up, I went all this time kind of, well, they're happy to have me in the family, and I'm part of the family. But then it came down to, you're the last guy to do anything. So if I had stumbled and this thing was a complete joke, that would have been the last word on the Lord of the Rings either way, So you kind of had to make it good. You had to do something that was worthy of, this sort of legacy and lineage that had built up to this to this moment. So it got to be a lot of pressure at a point.
Yeah, I mean, and as if the book being a document of this extraordinary work wasn't enough, you guys threw in that Rarities CD,
Yeah.
which, like, and the minute I remember you saying that the trailer music for Return of the King was going to be on there, I was like, yes. Because there's some great stuff on there, and it felt like, especially after, because we had the original soundtrack albums for Lord of the Rings, and then the complete recordings came out, and right. And this did feel like, just one more soundtrack release, and it was. I remember I was really looking forward to it, and
yeah. It was just about the last thing we did. I'm trying to remember. I mean, the layout of the book, I think. Well, no, actually, to be honest, the mastering of the CD might have been the very last thing we did. I think we were doing that up until hours before it went to the plant. It was, we had a big push at the end. We had to do, I think some people know this, I'm not sure, but we had to do the book twice. We had a whole other layout the year before. So originally that 09 concert in New York, which I think was Radio City, right? We did Radio City that year.
Yeah.
But that was supposed to have been the big release of the book. And we had spent the entire previous summer laying this thing out. And we kind of ran into some trouble with some rights stuff, and had to kind of step back and reconsider a few things. But then we had to do the entire book over again. So I think I got back from those Radio City concerts, which were amazing. And I mean, to be able to, once again, this is the guy that thought he was going to write a paragraph is now speaking to whatever Radio City seats. It's like 6,000 or 7,000 people. So that was a long way from this. Yeah, there you go. Now turn that picture backward and imagine sitting up there. But we got back from that, and within days, we're starting the book all over. I mean, everything was written. The text didn't change, and the concept didn't change, but the whole layout had to be redone. And a wonderful, wonderful layout artist from England, Gary Day Ellison, did the whole thing. And it was a very intense period of work. It's hard. I don't know how Peter Jackson did this for so many years, where you have like 2 work schedules on different continents trying to line them up. So I'd be getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning and kind of reviewing what layout had been done the night before in England, and trying to send notes before midday so that whatever needed to be addressed by that time would be finished before working hours were up. And it was very tough. It was a long process, and just kind of the 2 of us hammering away at that for a while. And then the CD at the same time, I was going out to New York, and it took, all those alternate pieces were in Howard's files, but they were just kind of, they had just finished. So things hadn't been sorted through yet. It was just a giant pile of things. So I had to go through kind of everything that was in there and pick out, like, well, this passage is different. This is where this goes. And this is where that came from. This is the early version of this, or whatever. And then sort of find something that made sense as a sort of a listening experience, and sort of an archive. That is really what we called it. And we had originally filmed. I've put these out on the internet a couple times. I probably should stop putting them out there. But we filmed some stuff that originally we were thinking, well, we might do a DVD where we kind of explain each piece and why it's different than what you heard in the film or what you heard on the album. And we decided it made more sense as sort of an audio album, but we took some of the audio from our interview and put it at the end of the album. And I think, as I say, sometimes I've put video of our outtakes of that online sometimes, where Howard and I were messing up our lines.
So you're saying this is an announcement of a DVD release?
No, I don't. Anyone. I mean, these poor people have to listen to my horrible Midwestern playing for this long already. You imagine a DVD full of this, people? Nobody needs that. But yeah, we used all the good bits made the CD. So we don't need to watch us sit and hem and haw. We go, I think this is an early version of, or no, wait, no, it's not. So yeah, we use the better stuff.
Okay, so now let's just dive into the music. There's plenty of music to talk about, because I really do want, because there's a lot of people I think in the chat who probably, they may, hear the music and say, oh, that's, beautiful, which it is. But revisiting this book again, I was struck by like how many ideas there are in this score.
Yeah.
You often think that, well, maybe for this interlude, the composer will just write something that sounds nice here, but like almost everything is tied to the character arcs, and what, combining, like segueing between, one theme or another, setting something up that'll pay off in the next film. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So I'd love to just talk about some of these themes, and I figure we could start at the beginning because the prologue introduces a lot of thematic material, but it started off quite different, didn't it? Because I feel like there's an early version of that piece, and then the film version actually goes in some different directions. It even, in the final film, it starts off with the Lothlorien theme, which, if you listen to the original soundtrack album, it plays out a little different. So could you just talk a little bit about that process?
Well, if I remember correctly, the prologue to Fellowship of the Ring was actually, I think it was, and I'm just talking about in terms of the film, but I think it came into the film relatively late into the process, and I think it might have been the result of a studio note. And I apologize if I'm wrong, but I think that's what happened, is that the studio kept saying, well, we need something to like set up what is this world and what are the stakes, and you kind of have to set the stage a little bit more. And I think Peter Jackson might have bristled at the idea at first and then kind of got into it as it went. But because of that, it was a work in process for quite some time, and there was a lot of thought went into how to introduce the score. Did the score become a self-contained piece at that point? Does it underscore, you see this character and hear this theme, you see this and then hear that theme, or does it sort of, does it stand apart thematically? Does it maybe just have its own identity? And so they tried a number of different things. The original album version of it, so this is like before the expanded CD, the complete recording CDs. There's an early version of that on there, and I think we have another version of it on the rarities as well. Originally, that scene musically was going to be used to set up a lot of the history of Gondor. So you were going to hear the Gondor theme in there, and it was going to play a large role from the prologue on. The Gondor theme, as it is, appears in Fellowship of the Ring when Boromir speaks at the Council of Elrond. But it was originally going to be in the prologue as well, and the scene where they pass between the Argonath, that was going to be a huge statement of the Gondor theme. And I think actually I've mentioned this bit of trivia before, but if people haven't heard it, if you listen to the commentary track on the DVD and Blu-ray of Fellowship of the Ring, the one where Howard Shore is talking, he refers to that as a Gondorian theme, and he's referring back to the version of that bit of music that's not in the film. In the film, they use the History of the Ring theme. The original intent there was to use the Gondor theme. Anyway, so the prologue went through a similar process where Gondor is going to be all over the place, and some of the themes got pushed around, and they decided it was a little bit of information overload. Gondor is really going to be more central to the third film and the third score, so you kind of needed to build up to it more. So there's tiny clips of it in Fellowship, tiny clips of it in Two Towers, and then Return of the King is kind of more focused on Gondor. So because of that, things, you take out Gondor, you have to sort of move this piece here, and then for the sake of balance, this, everything is sort of interconnected, and that's really how the prologue came together musically. I've always liked that about it, that it starts with Galadriel's voiceover, and it begins with the Lothlorien theme, which is sort of her theme as well. Characters, especially in the Lord of the Rings films, are mostly represented by location themes. There's not a lot of individual character themes in the Lord of the Rings films. That's more Howard's approach to The Hobbit was a little bit different, where there's more character themes, but this was all sort of location and culture and things like that. But I love that theme with that wonderful scale, that Makam Hijaz that he uses there. It sets the tone so beautifully for Lord of the Rings, because it's exotic sounding to Western ears, but not in a non-tonal way. It's sort of has a bit of smoky mystery to it, and kind of eases you into a world that is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And I think that works a lot better than if you just blasted out the history of the ring right off the bat, big fanfare. And that's not to say anything against scores that start with giant fanfares, because I can certainly name a few of those that worked awfully well. But I thought it was a perfect way to get into Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, as I came out of these projects, one of the first things that I found incredibly appealing about it is that all of the filmmakers, and this goes everybody working on the film, the actors, the director, the musicians, Howard himself, everybody treated this like historical mythology. They didn't treat it like a show. Yeah. You know what I mean? It wasn't just like another job. This could have been a film about Zeus or Achilles or Wotan or Siegfried or any of these things. Historical fiction was really the approach to it. So when they would talk about something, they didn't ever say, well, when Sean goes up the steps on this set, it's when Sam ascends the stairway in Moria or whatever. It was always character names and locations. They completely bought into that mythology. And I think that was the approach, that historical approach. And that's why the beginning of that score is such an unusual and wonderful choice to sort of start on a, in terms of importance, it's sort of a C-level theme. You know what I mean? It's not a huge structural element of these scores. It is an important element, and it certainly has a very specific meaning, but it's an unusual choice to begin these scores. And that's one of the things I love about it. It just sort of eases you into this history,
Yeah, I've always felt that these films just, because they're obviously blockbuster films. They, appeal to, they give you the action, and all that stuff. But there's something that feels, as you say, sort of mythical and lived in. And so it's got that feeling of this really old kind of epic storytelling. And I think that's what was so extraordinary. It made everything feel real and tangible. I remember that specifically when the films came out. And I think because that was really different for fantasy, I felt at the time. Yeah. So that everybody was able to take it very seriously. And that's befitting Tolkien's fantastic work.
There's a period in opera that we always refer to as the Verismo period of opera, where things went away from operas by the numbers, where you would stop the story to have the soprano come out and do her big aria. And I always thought that it was possible that Lord of the Rings sort of ushered in an era of Verismo filmmaking or filmic storytelling, or whatever you'd like to say, but where it felt, it was not manufactured. You never feel that they're on sets. You never feel that they're being lit. It's just sort of, opening a window into this, into Middle Earth, right? It feels like a history. It's a very compelling history. It's not a dry, and then this begat this, but it's a very exciting history, but it feels very realistic. It feels very tangible.
Yeah. And speaking of which, that's actually a good segue into talking about Hobbiton, because just the fact that they planted the gardens of Hobbiton a year beforehand.
Yeah, right.
And so that felt so lived in, and the music for Hobbiton. I mean, that opening sequence, especially I love the theatrical or the extended versions completely, don't get me wrong, but there is something about that opening in the theatrical version that's this beautiful segment that just has the concerning hobbits tune playing over the whole thing. And it's just, I remember seeing that in theaters, and it had this feeling of, especially when Frodo says, "Gandalf, I'm glad you're back," and Gandalf says, "So am I." I always say that feels almost, it's like the audience is part of that, especially those who know and love Tolkien, because it feels like you're returning home, seeing
Right.
that
It makes you nostalgic for a place you've never been. Yeah.
yeah, and Howard's music for that is just, it's breathtaking. And I'm sure I played that on CD like 1,000 times over, and which is funny because it's probably the most joyful tune on that original soundtrack album. Everything else is so
well, and it's such a shift from came before it, because it is very tuneful, and it shrinks the score down. You know, we've had these massive epic forces in the prologue, you know, giant mixed chorus and huge orchestral forces and Japanese drums and all sorts of wonderful things. I think the monochord is in there for the Lothlorien thing. And then suddenly you shrink down to like a folk band, you know, it tin flute and dulcimer and mandolin and guitar and things like that. The very first time I heard these scores, I remember thinking, well, is he just going to use like a different palette for each culture? How will this ever be able to relate to the rest of the score? Because you went to something it's so non-traditionally orchestral. You went from these massive orchestral forces to something that was very, you know, it's like a pub band kind of thing. And of course, little did I realize that would be part of the genius of these scores, that by the end of the story, that theme has moved into the larger orchestral tapestry and has become a part of the big view of Middle Earth, you know, that sort of overhead view. That's why these things are so cool too, because it's not just little themes, you know, like you said, everything has meaning in it. And it would have been very easy to just sort of done a needle drop thing with the Shire theme. And every time you talk about the Shire, you hear plink, 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 and the clarinet maybe comes out and you get some dulcimer and you get some harp. But it develops, it becomes, you know, the change that these characters go through is reflected in the music, even to the point where when you get to the end of Return of the King, when they head back to the Shire, all the themes have changed. You get little bits of the traditional Shire theme, but there's kind of a new Fourth Age Shire theme. Things have changed. So there's a true narrative and musical progression to everything, which is a super cool thing.
And there's elements in, you know, reading from your book, there's elements of that early Shire music that makes its way into the Gollum's Menace theme, which is extraordinary. And I don't think that's something that I would have consciously thought of before reading your book, which is one of the joys of doing that, and then realizing because, you know, because after all, Gollum was once, you know, a hobbit or something like a hobbit, you know, so to bring that element of the music but turn it on its head,
right,
it's just a stroke of genius.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So the hobbits get the dulcimer, which is a sort of a tabletop instrument with wires going across it. It's a smaller one, tends to be diatonic, so it would be, you know, like the white notes of a piano, for example. Gollum got its larger Hungarian relative, the cimbalum or the cymbalum, which is a chromatic instrument, much bigger, but it's still, you know, wires on a tabletop thing that you play with these little mallets and gives that kind of twitchy sound. So it represented both Gollum's sort of physical presence and his twitchy nature, but at the same time, it was tied to the sounds that Howard had used for the Shire. So you had that connection between the two, but you saw the different versions of everything, which is, again, you know, the amount of planning and forethought that Howard put into these scores was absolutely remarkable.
And, you know, obviously, as far as the Shire goes, we do kind of leave that, you know, the upbeat, you know, theme behind as the story moves beyond the Shire, but plenty of that music does still come along. I think probably one of my favorite pieces of music throughout the entire story is the theme of Hobbit's Understanding, which plays over, you know, key moments of, you know, when Gandalf and Frodo talk in Moria, and then the emotional climaxes of both Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers. Right. And it's just when we get to that point in Two Towers, when Sam is giving, his speech, and you have all these images from, what all the Fellowship is going through, and this music just soars over all of it. I still get tears.
Yeah, it's a more developed version of that Shire material. I mean, the Shire material is a very simple, folksy tune. It's almost a sort of just little simple pentatonic scale thing, and not quite only pentatonic, but it's definitely based on that. And then it sort of takes on this more, grand orchestral guise for these moments, like the moments in Moria and the moments at the end of the Two Towers, and it's part of the way that this score, it moves the Shire themes into the big orchestral world, the same way that the Hobbit characters are moving into the larger world of Middle Earth. So it really echoes what's happening. That, to me, Howard, in addition to all of his genius, Howard did me a wonderful favor by making these scores so beautifully and completely narrative that to write about them, all you really need to do is explain what's happening. It doesn't take, it didn't take any huge creative stretches on my part to try to explain these things, because it was so inspiring to listen to the amount of careful thought and planning and meticulous execution that he put into these things. So it was these things are always work, because they just the amount of time it takes to do something. But it was a very naturalistic process, because I just found all these things so moving, and there was so much, just genius level thought put into these things.
Yeah, I mean, you go through the score and you see how each moment is developed, and obviously this is not a revelation, because Howard has said as much, you've said as much, but his score really is telling the story musically. So it's
right.
It's like another adaptation of Tolkien, even separate from the films.
Yeah, it's telling the story in parallel. Every element that's in these stories is in the score, which I think is part of the reason the albums work so incredibly well, because you don't miss any elements of the storytelling. I mean, these scores kind of hit every single beat and show every single progression, and they really are complete works of art. The fact that they still work so seamlessly in film, which is a difficult medium to write for, because you could write glorious music and stick it behind film, and there's too many things happening at once, and they conflict with one another, and the mix is sort of weird, and blah blah blah. So the fact that these things work so wonderfully as film music, that they can intersect with the visuals and with other sounds and things like that, and yet they still have everything in them. The full story of the Ring is in these scores. They are complete. They are narratively complete. It's amazing. It's an incredible feat. It was one of those things where, it was so well done that it's like an instinctive type of thing. It's almost, you couldn't plan those things. Whatever part of your brain works in that manner wouldn't have been able to pull this off. It's the part of the brain that is just sort of, inspired and automatic in a way.
I want to sidetrack for a moment, because we're talking about how great this music is and sort of the genius behind it. I have to ask, what's Howard like?
Yeah. Oh, he's great. Part of my work, going back to the magazine that I wrote for Films Corner Monthly, was I was sort of the one musician on staff at the time. Eventually, other musicians came on, which I was happy to see that happen, because I think it's good for the art. But early on, I was often given many of these composer interviews, because I was someone that could speak to these composers in their language. I didn't have to. I didn't say the happy part. I didn't say the sad part. I would. A part where the counterpoint is doing this. I knew the details of it. Many of these, most of these composers, like most people in life, if you're successful, you tend to be a sort of friendly person. It's kind of how it goes. A lot, being mean to people doesn't really help you either as a human being or as a professional. But Howard was always unusually nice. Nice sounds like a very kind of it's a weak modifier, I suppose. But he was always very kind to me and very supportive and very, very friendly. I've told this joke 1,000 times, but I always kind of figured that maybe it was my Midwestern temperament. I'm from Chicago, and his Canadian temperament. He's originally from Toronto. It sort of meshed very well. But even for the years before anything happened with Lord of the Rings, he would, I was living at home in grad school. He'd call my house, get my parents on the phone, and he would, we would do the interview, and then we'd kind of sit for an extra 45 minutes on the phone, just talk about what we'd seen, what we'd heard, and just what we thought was interesting in the arts, what we thought was interesting in the world, and he was always incredibly kind to me. And to this day, it's been a little while since we've done anything together, just because it's a busy time and the world's kind of a mess lately, I'm sad to say. But he's still family, and he will always be family. He's kind of Uncle Howard in a very unofficial but very real way at the same time. He's very patient. He's very serious about his art, but has a wonderful wry sense of humor. He is never quick to anger. He's very careful, with his words and with his moods. He's what people want him to be. We used to do these things. Howard was always, in the early day of his film career, he did all these sort of, creepy Cronenberg things, right? He did, The Brood and things like that. And it was kind of cerebral and body horror and things like that. But we always knew he was an amazing composer. He was like our secret weapon composer, though. Like those of us that were very into film music and whatever, we knew about him, but he wasn't mentioned in the same family-friendly breath as John Williams or James Horner or even Jerry Goldsmith, even though Jerry Goldsmith had some strange projects on his CV, but I think that was just the kind of stuff he was taking at that point. But as Howard became more well-known and really a household name, it would make me laugh that this guy that used to write, the body horror films and The Fly and things like that, like little kids would want to come up and sit on his lap at concerts and get pictures. And, they it's the same thing, like, go to meet Santa Claus. You're like excited and then you get nervous when you're there. And he would even remark it. They'd kind of come up and want their picture. Like, it's like meeting Santa. But he was wonderful with them. He was very kind to the families. He's a very private individual. So he isn't going to sit and, give away personal information. He likes his private life. And I think he absolutely deserves that. But he is what people hope he is like. He's just a very, incredibly intelligent, incredibly creative, and incredibly kind human being. I can't say anything bad about him, but I can't say enough nice about him.
I wonder when, because I'm sort of marveling over what it must be like to, have that sort of, rapport with someone, and then, as you said, you would sit in the orchestra, and then to hear this music that he would deliver. I mean, what was sort of your sort of response when you would hear this stuff coming from him?
I haven't to this day rectified that in my mind. I have a brilliant, kind friend named Howard, and I have a bunch of music that I really love. But I am unable to put those two together in my mind. I know that they're one and the same. Howard created this music, but I can't put that together in my mind. It seems all of us who work on music at some point, we feel that we're a conduit for something that's just, moving through us and going into instruments or onto paper or whatever we happen to be doing. So maybe there's an element of that where I just kind of think, well, that's the guy that all that music came through. But, really, he is the creator of all these themes that we love and this incredible story. And this goes beyond Lord of the Rings, but all the wonderful scores that he's done. He's done so much incredible work and continues to do so much incredible work. But I could never quite wrap my mind around the fact that, he and I would be goofing around backstage telling stupid jokes to each other while we were waiting to go on and do a pre-concert lecture or whatever. But to think that's actually the guy that wrote all this, it seems, I don't know. I'll go, even to this day, I'll catch like a really old episode of Saturday Night Live. Like, oh, there's Howard hanging around with John Belushi, and you kind of forget like somehow that all really happened. But those are the best stories, the ones you can't believe that actually happened.
Yeah, on the subject of his other stores, anytime you want to write more full-length books, dive into stores like Hugo. I'm a huge fan of his.
Yeah, I see you've got Hugo on your Twitter page, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make it my mission to spread that love to all of my viewers who haven't seen the film, because it's a great one. But
my one film credit. I got my name at the end of Hugo for a little bit of work on that one. Yeah.
That's cool.
That was pretty cool.
That's kind of wild, though, that your name actually. So it doesn't appear anywhere in Lord of the Rings.
No, I'm in the documentaries. Although I think more so for the Hobbit than Lord of the Rings. It was. I tried to tell a story one time that I was so excited when the second Hobbit film came out. We did a big documentary. Actually, we did a couple documentaries. I guess I did one of the video blogs that Peter Jackson was doing at the time when they were making the Hobbit films. But then we did a really lengthy documentary that we shot out in LA to put on the Blu-ray for Desolation of Smaug.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really, really fun to work on that. And I remember, like, I was telling you, I was so excited. They put my name in the end credits, and I finally got my name in the official, Middle Earth font that they use on all these things. And then someone pointed out to me, your name was in the last one too. I didn't realize that I was in the credits. I've been telling this, all these excited stories about, I finally got my name in the credits, and they put it in their official font. I'm like, oh no, that happened like a year ago, dummy. I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, I got in some of those things. So it's again,
yeah,
the guy that thought he was going to write a paragraph. Now I'm sitting. We actually did all the documentary work, the parts that I was involved with for Desolation of Smaug. We were sitting on one of the, I don't know if it was a set or behind the scenes thing from one of the X-Men movies. So I was actually like sitting in like the X-Men set talking about Desolation of Smaug, and it was a very surreal experience. And one of, obviously very many surreal experiences, but somehow that happened too.
Yeah, once again, another plug for all of the documentaries for all of these films, and that portion of it for the film score on the Desolation of Smaug set, that's absolutely wonderful. That's probably my favorite part of that documentary.
I can't believe they let us do that. Not that anyone would have prevented it, but to actually show how one theme comes out of another theme, and then you get to sit down and play it on a keyboard and demonstrate it, and then they show a little bit of written music, which is very, very well done. It actually syncs up correctly. Those of us are, everybody has like a bugaboo of something on film that is a specialty, but they always do wrong. And for music people, it's usually torture to watch any scene where someone's supposed to be making music, because they're just kind of flailing around, not really touching anything, or the written music, everything's upside down and backwards. So it was incredibly heartening to see these documentaries where they did it right. You're actually seeing the music you're hearing, and everything's synced up correctly. So yeah, they really were very careful with that. I was appreciative. And I'm shocked they let us do, kind of a mass marketed music lesson supported by a giant film studio. That was awesome.
Yeah, especially where I get into my little mini criticism about modern day home video releases, but it's becoming more of a rarity to see those extensive bonus features and stuff. So it was really gratifying when the Hobbit films came out that they were allowed to have these massive documentaries that were even more expansive than the Lord of the Rings ones.
Yeah, a few years later, I bet it would have been tough, because everything's moving towards, as we know, towards streaming media. People aren't buying physical stuff anymore, so there just aren't the budgets.
No, I don't want to hear that. Okay, so we're about an hour in. I'm just going to pause here real quick and let people know what's coming up. First of all, if you are new to the channel, go ahead and if you like what you've been seeing, hit the subscribe button. Next month in December, my co-host Amy and I are actually going to be covering all 3 of the Lord of the Rings films 3 weeks in a row. So you'll want to come back for that. And next week, we're going to be taking a break, though. We're going to be covering the film Colette, starring Keira Knightley. So make sure you stop by for that. And
great score by Thomas Adès, better known as a concert hall composer, but did a wonderful job with that film.
I waited and waited for that soundtrack to be released, and finally it was.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Yeah, and of course, tomorrow Amy will be on Here Be Dragons, being interviewed by my brothers, Stephen Stark, for an episode of I Know That Nerd. And also, please check out not only his channel, but our other co-host's channel, Nessie the Questing Beast. She has a channel called The Unspun Yarn. So go ahead and check that out. She does deep dives into mythology and all that stuff. So please check her out. And then, of course, you'll also want to take a look at my co-host Amy. She has a channel full of great stuff where she studies Chinese literature and all that stuff, and also dives into A Song of Ice and Fire and plenty of other stuff. You can find the link for her stuff in the description below. Okay, I think I got everything I was supposed to.
Yeah, I'm killing the time here reading all these people on the right side of my screen, all these comments. What's everybody talking about? I feel like I've lost track of the comments. I apologize. Did anybody actually say anything that I was supposed to have read? Sorry, everybody.
Well, some of them are probably on topic, and some of them are probably on to something completely different.
Okay. Oh, hi, everybody.
Okay, so, and then they're diving back into the music. I mean, I could continue to go on about Hobbiton, but we'll move on to the Fellowship music, which the Fellowship theme is so pervasive through so many different character themes, because it weaves its way not only with not just have the main Fellowship theme, but it weaves its way into Aragorn's theme, Gandalf the White with the White Rider, and it's just amazing. And I love that the score reaches like its full orchestral might in Fellowship of the Ring when they're all joined together, but then after that it's never quite the same. And that's just sort of the brilliant sort of narrative work of this music that I love, that theme can come back, but it's not the same once they're splintered, and especially after Boromir dies. But then of course there is that brilliant choral version near the end of Return of the King, Frodo, which, by the way, I have to say, I was waiting years for that complete recording of Return of the King for that piece of music, because I almost feel like you guys were, you put out the Return of the King soundtrack and it was full of great music, but I feel like you guys left some surprises for the audience.
I don't know if that was actually the plan. We were very careful about this. My friend Allison is telling me not to say hello to her right now. Okay, Allison, I won't say hello. Sorry. But we were very careful about not trying to make anybody buy things over and over again. We wanted this to be sort of the antithesis of commercialism. We tried to make something where if you bought it once, we weren't going to scam you and say like, well, here it is again, but we added 3 measures and you have to buy it all over again. So I don't think they were being actively cutthroat with anything being left off of the original CDs. Those things were so hard to balance, In my mind, these scores really function best as complete complete narrative, with all the pieces in place, because you can see that linear progression of everything. So to try to do them as essentially, hour-long suites, which is kind of what those original albums were, it's hard. It's very hard, tremendously hard to balance those things out. And you almost have to throw narrative to the wind and just seek a sort of musical balance. But even that is hard, because those, the big moments and the small moments are so carefully structured, carefully plotted and separated from one another to make a beautiful shape. It was a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. And I will be honest, if I listen to these scores, I always go back to the long versions. I think most people do these days. I think, I bet, I actually don't know what any of the statistics are, but I bet the people are saying hi to Allison in the comments, and I'm going to be murdered by Allison on Monday. Oh, there. Thank you, Here Be Dragons. We reversed the flow there. But I don't know. I really hope she's watching this. Actually, I hope she's not, because this might be my last interview. But I do wonder how many people, like the initial fandom, bought the shorter releases. Oh, I got a text. She hates me now. That's great. Do you think Ian McKellen's watching this part? I apologize to Ian. That was actually one of my great thrills of this. I'll come back to stories that are actually on topic, but I had to write a commercial one time for the 2009 concert you saw in New York. And they said, well, who should we get to read the commercial? And I just said dumbly, I don't know, see if Ian McKellen would do it. And so they got him. And then they came to me like a day later and said, can you write a commercial? What? So I had to write copy for a commercial that Ian McKellen read, like 24 hours after I read it. I think he was in maybe Scotland at the time and just kind of popped into a recording studio and did a half an hour of lines that I'd written for him the day before. So I got to write stuff for Ian McKellen. So Sir Ian, if you're still watching, you are an absolute gentleman, and everybody loves you. Rightly.
Which, by the way, I have to take a moment to talk about how surreal this was, that Sir Ian McKellen retweeted the announcement that I put out about this stream. And it was so funny because I had left my phone to the side for a little while yesterday, and then I came back to it, and all of a sudden there's, it was like a minute or two after he retweeted it, and there's 20 alerts or whatever on my phone. I'm like, what the heck is going on? It's not every day that happens. So Sir Ian, if you are watching, thank you very much, and you're awesome.
Yeah, he's another one that's in that category of somebody that's so talented and so kind that it's absolutely unbelievable. But what a absolutely brilliant actor.
Yeah, Erin texted me in all caps. She was losing her mind just as much as I was.
Ah, that's great.
So, okay, so now working my way back to my train of thought.
Sorry, I derailed you, but yeah.
Yeah, no. Actually, I know what I wanted to ask, because we were talking about the soundtrack and and putting out the original album versions. Erin actually had a question about that, because she wanted to know what the process of that was like. Was the idea to keep the major motifs or distinct moments, or just was it favorite pieces of music?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't directly involved with that part of it. I really, in terms of albums, I was able to sort of throw in my 2 cents on the extended editions, but I think the idea was, largely as you're suggesting, that you kind of hit it's like a highlight reel. You have to hit those major moments here and there. There was also some moments that didn't make these albums because of the way these things were done. The albums, the initial albums for these scores were generally locked, pardon me, in October, the year that these films were released. So say Return of the King came out in 2003, December of 2003. The album had to be locked in October of 2003. However, the recording sessions kept going until mid to late November 2003, and then resumed the following spring for extended edition. So these albums actually had to be assembled before the scores themselves were, complete. So that's why there are some moments that were not on the original scores because they didn't, or the original album releases, because they didn't exist yet. And that's, again, one of the tricky realities of physical media. We all love physical media, but it's physical. Somebody has to make it, and somebody actually has to have a drop dead date where you can't do anything else on it, no matter what else is happening. because you have to send things to plants and to printers and things like that. So,
Everybody's, I'm picturing everybody laughing at me right now because I'm always going on about physical media. So now it's kind of it's a meme in our chat group. Whenever somebody mentions John, they're like, physical media. So yeah.
Hey, I love me some physical media. Don't get me wrong. You know, I will go out of my way anytime I see an album come out that I think somebody has really pushed to make it something special, even if I can get it on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, I'll make sure I buy it. I'm a huge fan. I haven't really, I must admit, gotten involved with the vinyl craze, but I do love Blu-ray audio and super SACD, super audio CD. I don't even know what it stands for. But things like that will still attract my attention. So yeah, I hope physical media never goes away. I hope it doesn't become just a complete niche thing. But
well, especially right now for film store lovers, you've got smaller labels like, and I guess I'm. Yeah.
Well, like Entrada,
I'm doing promotion.
Amazing. Yeah. I've got my my most recent acquisition is this Lionel. I don't know who did this one. The War of the Worlds CD. John Williams score from what is it? 05. It's Entrada. So yeah, people are still doing these things. So.
Yeah, and those are beautiful expanded scores, and so much work is put into them. And talking about writing up stuff for music, a lot of care is put into those liner notes where, they try and fit in as much as they can in a little booklet for a CD. And for a film score fan, those releases are invaluable. And so I feel like without physical media, I wouldn't be able to enjoy those because you're not going to, at least not at this stage, you're not going to see those put out digitally. So,
right.
So, physical media all the way for me, definitely. Yeah. So, so I just kind of wanted to, jumping back into the Fellowship theme, kind of if you could talk a bit about,
Right.
A bit about it and how it offshoots into different characters' themes.
Well, the Fellowship theme, again, whether by planning or by instinct, Howard made a brilliant choice with the opening of that theme, where it's based on a very specific shape, and we always kind of laugh that it's in musical terms. I'll put it in a simple key. It would go C, B flat, C. It goes down a whole step, back a whole step. We realized that he had created a there and back again in music. He'd kind of done that with a musical contour. But it's such a malleable shape that you could work it into these other themes as references to other characters' connections. So the Aragorn theme has that shape all over the place. When Gandalf returns as Gandalf the White, it's in his theme as well. It shows that these characters, because of their participation in the Fellowship, even though by that point the Fellowship had sort of broken and was sort of kind of over, but not really. But the 9-member Fellowship no longer existed. But it could show how these characters fulfilled their destinies by participating in the Fellowship. And it's such a simple shape that you can work it into so many things. So there's little references to it all over the place. Howard is a master of that, where you can reference a theme with the slightest gesture. That down and back shape from Fellowship is all over the place. The history of the ring, and this was especially noticeable, I thought, in the Hobbit scores. He reduced it to its most basic element, which was 2 notes. You go from the sharp 4 to the 5 in a chord. You can go over a major chord, over a minor chord, whatever. But if you stretch it out far enough and orchestrate it in a sort of very clean way, it immediately becomes a reference to the ring. And it's such an incredibly subtle thing, but it's you can put it anywhere. It's what's so great about it. So you never kind of feel like, these scores that have a lot of motivic elements, they do start to feel like attention deficit theater at some point, where you're this theme, then this theme, then this theme. It's just a parade of themes. And Howard is so careful about that and so brilliant with this, that he creates themes that can be woven into a larger tapestry. So you're not switching channels all the time. You're just referencing things as the music has its own organic flow. So the Fellowship thing was like that. The History of the Ring theme was like that. The Hobbit theme. That's why there's so many variations on the Hobbit theme, because if you have that stepwise motion, 1, 2, 3, in a sort of, a certain rhythmic profile, you can immediately reference that, and it can work into any larger musical moment. So it doesn't, start and stop and get all herky jerky. You can have a beautiful musical flow to everything, but still reference these themes. Howard had really never done a big leitmotivic tapestry like this before,
which amazes me.
Yeah,
because it's so. I'm not saying that it was effortless for him to do, but it feels so effortless when you look at, because there's over 90 themes
right
in this score. 90 themes. That's just absolutely extraordinary. And to hear that he hadn't really done it to that degree before is amazing to me.
Yeah, well, it turned out that he had a calling for it, though, because it certainly, he fell right into it. It was amazing. But it was also wonderful because he had his own way of doing it. It didn't follow precisely in the sort of European musical language that we've been accustomed to when people are dealing with this sort of leitmotivic writing. We often reference Wagner's work in this type of writing, but it's actually more prolific in the early European composers that fled to the U.S. to Hollywood when political situations got so bad and World War II was brewing, and that's it's a very European musical language, even though it was happening in Hollywood, it's happening in the United States. But that's kind of the language we associate with this type of leitmotivic writing. And Howard had his own unique approach to it. It's not sort of in anybody's. He's not following a certain school of thought. It is following the Howard Shore school of thought and doing it his way and putting his own imprint on it. And that's part of the reason that these scores are so unique and special, because they don't really sound like anything else. I've heard people say, and I agree with it to a degree, that you can hear a bit of Sibelius in some of these scores and things like that. Like it's more of a a very unique kind of. I don't want to say quiet, because that kind of suggests a certain dynamic shape or whatever. But they're very they're understated in a lot of ways, or they're not full of frills and trills and sort of orchestral acrobatics and things like that. It's a very unique, streamlined way of writing some of these things. And I don't mean, I'm using all the wrong adjectives. This is why I say I'm not a writer, I'm a musician. But they have a very contained profile. These scores do. Howard writes in a very specific way for orchestra. He isn't writing a kind of European counterpoint. He's writing things. He'll often say that he thinks of the orchestra in terms of range. So if he's writing, in the higher range, to him, flutes and upper range trumpets and strings above the staff and violin one and things like that, like they all sort of exist in the same family. He's not breaking them down into the traditional roles as woodwinds, brass, and strings. And it's why these scores have a very cohesive sound to them. You don't hear, they're as layered as anything that's European, but you don't hear those layers standing apart from one another in the same way. And I think that's part of what makes the Howard Shore sound, in my opinion. Yeah,
there's something about the music that, again, talking about the way the films feel like some old piece of mythology or something. Right. There's something very old sounding about the score, as if it's from a completely different age.
Yeah, and that's part of what he wanted to do. He always said he wanted to make it sound like someone had found these scores in an old chest someplace. And that's a cool way to approach it. It works.
Yeah, of course, the downside is I remember when the films were out and I'd listen to other scores, like everything was always competing against Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings, like anything in Hollywood that becomes enormously popular, had a lot of scores that sort of tried to adopt that sound. And I don't know that any of them really made much of a mark. You know, these composers found that the reason Howard Shore sounds like Howard Shore is because it's his musical DNA, and it's not something you can sort of adopt as a, you know, put on a kind of musical costume. You kind of either have to write like that or you don't, and that's how he writes.
Yeah. And I guess since we're talking about how the Fellowship theme interacts with other characters, I'd like to talk about Gandalf the White, and that's actually a good point to also talk about how his theme interacts with nature as well, and then we'll move into that music, because the nature's reclamation is it's one of the greatest pieces of these scores, and I feel like I probably am going to say that a lot because there's a lot of great stuff. But I love that Gandalf the White's theme is sort of, it's bridging these multiple themes, bringing
Right.
together, as I said, the Fellowship theme and the nature theme. So can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, you know, most of the themes in Lord of the Rings tend to deal with culture and history and things like that. I've often said that these scores are a study in musical anthropology. You know, they're not just sort of character themes. But so Gandalf isn't really part of a specific culture. There's not a collection of wizard themes. There's some more wizard material in the Hobbit scores, but in terms of these scores, he's his own character. So he's more than anything else probably associated with both Fellowship and with nature. And of course, nature, like you said, has the nature's reclamation theme. And if people aren't, you know, this is one of the great challenges of doing these books. We had to come up with names for all these themes because it's the only way to discuss them, you know, either in text or verbally. But it does become sort of a word salad at a point where it's like, well, which one are we talking about? Some of the themes that are still used in the book were little nicknames that I gave the themes when I was working on Fellowship, when I was first analyzing that. And I had gone, like my first or second trip out there, and I jotted down these themes, you know, like the skip beat theme and the descending thirds and things like that. And I sent them to Howard's, to him directly, I suppose, to sort of show him what I was coming up with. And the next time I'd gone out there, everything had been cataloged with these stupid little, you know, thumbnail names that I'd given to everything because I just wanted to remember which one is which. So the fact that we still have the skip beat theme and the descending third theme is because those are the little names I jotted down and remember what the heck I was talking about. So they got stuck. But the nature's reclamation theme is the theme you hear when you see the moth. Gandalf catches it atop Orthanc, and then eventually becomes a huge player in these scores. It's the destruction of Isengard by the Ents is all underscored by that. The Rohirrim arriving at Pelennor is underscored with that.
Which, and I do have to say that this is one of the elements of the scores that, even when I first, when I wasn't as familiar with the music, but in the first few times that I saw all the films, just seeing how he would plant these little ideas and then they'd blossom over the course of the films. This, right, you know, very delicate theme, you know, that, you know, starts with Gandalf and the moth, transforms into this enormous orchestral fanfare almost, you know, in Return of the King. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, he does that with a lot of the material in there, and that was it's pretty unheard of at that point in film scoring. I'm trying to think if there were any precedents where the central theme of Return of the King is arguably the Gondor theme, which premiered 2 scores earlier, 2 years earlier. But I don't think there was. I'm not even sure I can think of any scores since that time where the main theme had appeared in an earlier segment and then kind of, you know, waited to come back. But that was you know, one of the things that Howard was very concerned with was the structure of these things. You know, the writing, Tolkien's writing is so incredibly structured. I think Howard was very inspired by the fact that Tolkien had created such a complex and fully functioning fantasy world. You know, everything down to like the phases of the moon and dates on the calendar and things like that. Everything was worked out. Every single detail was worked out. So I think Howard wanted to do that in a musical form where that kind of impeccable structure was woven into everything. So the nature theme is like that, where you get it, with a moth, certainly an agent of nature, but sort of the most humble agent of nature you can imagine, a little tiny bug. And that becomes, if not the grandest theme in the score, certainly one of them. It's an amazing theme because it's a constant harmonic rise. You can never really tell when it's going to hit a cadence. It just goes up and up and up and up, and everything is constantly modulating upward. It's like what's the shepherd's tone, where it seems to constantly spin upwards, that sonic phenomenon. It's a sort of musical shepherd's tone in a way, where you never feel that it's ever at the top of its phrase. It's a incredibly hummable theme all the same. Like even to this day, I find myself sitting around the Lord of the Rings themes still get stuck in my head, even the fact that I've heard these scores maybe more than anybody else. Howard used to joke that I knew the scores better than he did because he wasn't sitting on airplanes with them on his headphones. And it's hard to listen to your own music like that, but I certainly was.
Yeah, and of course, my dad made the typical joke when I mentioned to him the other day that I was doing this. And he said, "Oh, what are you worried about? You know these scores better than anybody." I'd say, "I don't think I know them better than this guy."
Yeah, well, that's all right.
Yeah,
as I said, I think you and I were talking about this before we opened the show, that I actually finally went back and watched the films for enjoyment the first time this spring, like the first time in a decade. And I must admit, I don't put on the scores a lot for passive listening, also because I'm paranoid they're going to find something like, oh, I should have mentioned blah blah blah. But I've heard them a lot of times between the research that we've done these scores and the live performances. I've been happy to have attended dozens of those all around the world, and so yeah, there's not much of these scores that I think I could purge from my mind even if I tried, and I have no interest in trying anyway, so that's fine.
Now, I do have to ask, and I'm sorry because you've probably talked about this a million times, but I'm very interested in how the editorial process played into the development of some of these themes, because in the final film, Nature's Reclamation comes back, for that moment between Theoden and Aragorn at the end of the Two Towers, and they ride out.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's actually different from the original intention of the score, which was, I believe, Gandalf the White's theme plays over that moment. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting then that theme went on in the next film to be associated with Rohan. So did that editorial choice kind of play into Howard's thinking for where to take that music next, or how did that play out?
I don't know if the Return of the King usage was specifically supposed to be a callback to Two Towers or anything like that. I mean, I think he always had a rather, we called it Nature's Reclamation, which we do stand by that name, but I think the idea was that nature was in the mythology of Middle Earth, nature is sort of a force for good. And I think there was that connection of like all things good and green, and you see it with the sun coming up with the Rohirrim and things like that. So I think there was just elements of sort of Middle Earth as an active agent in the storytelling. I think Nature's Reclamation is like any of these things. When you slap a name on something, it's both eye-opening and limiting at the same time. At least we gave it a better name than the skip beat thing. So, I've got a question. What musical instruments do I play? I started piano when I was a little kid. I studied all through, public school and university stuff. I'm a percussionist. These days, I end up probably playing more piano than I play percussion, but percussion is kind of my home base as a musician. I've got a theremin over here that I'm still trying to get any good at, but I'm absolutely rubbish at it right now. So I'll turn it on Halloween once in a while to scare the neighbors, but that's about the best I can do.
I think I probably have no greater regret than not learning how to play a musical instrument
It's
growing
never
up.
too late. Never too late.
Yeah, my co-host Amy plays. I'm trying to remember. She's going to kill me for not remembering. I'm trying to remember. She plays the violin.
Well, she just asked which instrument is best and why is it violin. So
okay, yeah. So,
probably right. Yeah,
so I'm trying to convince her that once the pandemic is over, she's going to have to train me. So.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Everyone should play an instrument. Didn't Bill and Ted just teach us that this past spring? Everybody should play an instrument. Come on, guys, get moving.
Well, because especially, I mean, as much as I'd like to fancy that, I might have some hidden talent as a composer, I probably don't. So the next best thing would be for me to be able to play music, and
yeah,
I'd really love to be able to do that. But yeah, no, but what we were just talking about with the sort of the editorial changes, what's nice is, I mean, better than nice, it's fantastic that when those complete recordings came out, to be able to hear some of the music play out as Howard intended. And so but I also enjoy that moment of nature's reclamation playing over that moment in the film. So I get to sort of have my cake and eat it too by having both, which, is really nice.
We showed an unusual amount of the behind the scenes choices that were made on the scenes, which were both a blessing and a curse, I must say, because these type of interactions with filmmakers, it's part and parcel for film music. This is how film music is made. It's a collaborative thing. And this is why, as I said before, people will sometimes act snobbishly towards it because they figure, well, anything that has compromise in it must somehow be, artistically flawed, despite the fact that's how everything is made. But we were very upfront about some of these choices in the Lord of the Rings. And I think people maybe glommed onto that more than we kind of expected they would, and started to think that this was a very unusual thing, that usually a composer working on a film is able to shut themselves away in a dark studio for 6 weeks and produce a fully formed film score that they then record and put into place, and nobody ever bothers it again. And any of these things is created. Everybody from the the greatest artists of film music down to the quietest practitioners, there is always an element of discussion, and compromise has such a dirty implication, but it's not. It's how art is created. We compromise with our own minds as we're, even if we're creating in isolation. So the fact that we showed off some of these things, people got a little, maybe the wrong impression that it was such an unusual thing for these scores. And then, of course, felt as if they were, defending somebody's honor by saying, well, how dare they make the brilliant Howard Shore's change, whatever. He liked some of the changes, When we went back to do the live scores, these concert presentations, there was discussion of how much of this should we make like the Composer's Revenge edition, where we go back to the original intention of some of these things. And we came very, very close. In fact, there was even the segment you mentioned with the end of the Two Towers. We almost, I say we like I had anything to do with it, but Howard almost considered in our discussions rewriting that to create a composition that used elements of Gandalf's theme and the nature theme to put a different ending on that score, so that if you'd seen it in the film, you were satisfied, and if you'd seen or heard it on the album, you were satisfied. Of course, we came to the ultimate realization that you would be satisfied with neither, because you were hearing a kind of a third hybrid piece of music, and it wouldn't have really.
Because I didn't get to see Two Towers live to projection. So which version did you guys?
It's the film version. It's the film version. And that was ultimately the decision, that people would know these scores. The majority of the audiences would know these scores through watching the films. And this was a filmic presentation, insofar as, even though the film was not central to the presentation, in my opinion, the music was, but it was still participating with the film, was still interacting with the film, so it should do what it usually did. And that's why, as I said, like Howard liked some of those choices and said, well, we should do what people have heard, because it works and it's solid and everybody's comfortable with that, and that's what we should do. So it isn't like here's a question. Was I at the outdoor concerts at Ravinia in Chicago? I sure was. Yeah. We did some book signings at Ravinia, although I was really late for the last one because I got stuck in traffic. So I may never be asked to do another signing at Ravinia because I think I irritated everyone by getting there late.
If I had my way, I would have been at every single one of those concerts. As it was, I could only really afford to do one, so it definitely had to be Fellowship, because I think there's just something inherently nostalgic about Fellowship, just because it was the first one, and I remember that concert being a really emotional experience for me. It just absolutely beautiful.
These days, those live to projection concerts are very common. Any sort of major film score from, I don't know, the 70s on, I suppose, some earlier, but they're often done by major symphonies. It seems crazy to me how, like the score to Star Wars has been done by most of the major symphonies in the world at this point, and plenty of the smaller symphonies as well. But when we did Fellowship of the Ring, I think it was in 2008, they did that in Lucerne in Switzerland, and an absolutely brilliant madman of a conductor named Ludwig Vicky put it all together over there. An incredible crew at the KKL, and it was the first time anything like that had been done. And I went over for that one and thought, like, there's no way they're gonna be able to pull this off. This is gonna, murder a conductor to have to get through this and keep his.
It sounds ludicrous to be able to.
They had done it a few years before. The only other sort of precedent for this is John Williams had done it with E.T., I think at the Hollywood Bowl. I'm pretty sure it was a Bowl concert. And the legend went that he finished that concert and said, I'm never doing that again. That's far too difficult to keep that synchronized for that long a period of time. Because, these things are hard. This is why you have, weeks, if not months of recording sessions for film scores, because it's a ton of work to get these things to synchronize. You're down to, each individual frame of lining these things up. So then to do that live for, a 3-hour film, 3-hour score, such as Fellowship, and it just got longer from there, it was insane, and the amount of preparation, the amount of they tried to track down all these instruments that, Howard had brought into the orchestra that were non-standard instruments. But they pulled it off, and it became a real phenomenon. It was a huge hit around Europe for a few years, and we kind of got it into the States as well. And now it's a sort of common thing. It's almost rare that classic film scores, at least from the last couple of decades, that they don't get a reading with a major orchestra. Most of them do now, and it's kind of cool. I mean, it's extremely cool. That's how these things become not just like a pop culture thing, but like a bit of musical literature. There are places now like the Boston Symphony Orchestra. If you want to play in the French horn section in Boston Symphony Orchestra, one of the excerpts you have to learn is the Ewok music from Return of the Jedi. These things are like standard rep now. It's amazing.
Yeah, and all of us Lord of the Rings fans are like, we were there before it was all the cool new thing. No,
the original hipsters. Yeah, we liked it before it was cool.
Yeah, God, that just brings back some utterly fantastic memories. And you know what? I debated whether this was self-serving or not, but I'm going to put it up because that weekend was so much fun for me, and I actually did get a chance to have my picture taken with Howard.
Hey.
Which was just a joy for me, and yeah. So
is that at the concert? Where's that from?
There was an event, like a day, or I think it was the day after, maybe on Sunday.
It was an old church or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, which, by the way, the pictures of that place that they showed made it look like a lot more upscale than it actually was. I remember going to that thing and I was like, is this the dangerous part of town?
I thought it was kind of cool. It was kind of
it was great. It was just different than what I expected, but it was so great to be there, and I was way too shy to actually interact with a lot of the people there, which is a shame because it was just a bunch of Lord of the Rings fans. But it was great to get to hear Howard talk, and it was a wonderful sort of cap to the whole weekend because I don't know if you remember, Billy Boyd was actually there that weekend. He had his performance.
Yeah, I'd had dinner with Billy the night before, that was also surreal for me because I got eventually used to hanging out with filmmakers. I'm still a little like not used to hanging out with the actors. That was strange for me. But Billy Boyd, I think he appeared on stage, right? He kind of waved to everybody from the stage, and then at this point in his life, Billy Boyd had a beard and was wearing like I don't know, whatever he's wearing, like a light suit or something at night. And then like a half an hour later, I did a book signing with Howard, and one of the people who had been in line came up to the table and had their book, and they said, could I have a hug, please?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, sure. That's a little strange, but sure." He's like, "Give her a hug." Like, oh, Billy, we just loved you in the movies. I couldn't figure out how they thought. I mean, I guess I could have changed clothes since being Billy Boyd on the stage, but I'd also gone backstage and shaved my beard off. So I wasn't sure why they thought I was Billy Boyd at that point, because I looked nothing like him and had like different, no facial hair. It was very confusing. But I guess people get nervous, so it's okay.
And as long as we're talking about Billy, I might as well be a little more self-serving and throw up another picture because
there he is. Yes, he's got a beard.
Yeah, it's like,
where do you think the beard went?
That's not very Hobbitsy.
Well, that's right.
But no, that was great. I remember I had both my Fellowship of the Ring DVD and my Master and Commander DVD for him to sign. That was such a fun weekend.
That was a wonderful experience. That took so much planning. We did 2 towers the following year, which was actually the year we finally got the book out. Also at Radio City, but then we waited many years. I think it became an issue of if we had done Return of the King there, the movie was just long enough that it would have gone over like into the next block of the Musicians Union timing, and it would have become like astronomically more expensive, like 6 digits more expensive or something like that. In fact, if I remember correctly, did we not? We might have not been able to do a pre-concert lecture at 2 Towers, because just to turn on the lights on the stage, it like officially started the clock, and we would have cost them like hundreds of thousands of dollars to walk on the stage and tell everyone what the fellowship name was. So we never quite got Return of the King at Radio City. It was too difficult to pull off. But we came back and did everything. It was about 4 years ago now, I think. We did a full cycle finally in New York. And it was wonderful to sort of finally get there and do the whole thing. And these things are starting up again. We did a whole cycle at Royal Albert in London, and it was actually due to start a new cycle this past October. Fellowship of the Ring is going to play at Royal Albert, but of course Royal Albert, like all concert halls, is closed right now. So we're hoping that maybe we can get that to happen in 21 or something like that, and sort of start some of these cycles over and get another shot at these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be ready to jump back in and go to another one. I think what was so gratifying about that, because that was before, I'm trying to think of exactly when it was announced that they were officially going to do The Hobbit, but I know that around when I went to that concert in, it was 2009, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it just felt like the movies were, a few years removed, but as a fan, you wanted to keep holding on to those memories and everything. And that was such a joyous experience, because it was just so many fans and coming together for this great experience. And it was kind of like a hybrid thing where the focus was on the music, but it almost felt like this great sort of communal, watching of the movie too, where it was getting to experience it emotionally in a way that was so completely different from what everybody was used to. And I just remember everybody in the audience being so happy.
That was, I've been to dozens of these things, but I think that was the most enthused crowd I was ever around. I mean, the horses were getting rounds of applause. The swords were getting rounds of applause. That audience was absolutely, keyed into the whole thing. It was amazing.
Well, it was funny because like all these character moments were getting applause, but then whenever, a soloist
right. Yeah.
And those would get applause. So the whole thing just wound up being, there were constant, applause, and it was so great. And I'm really grateful that you guys ended up putting out that symphony recording, because it got to showcase, things like, Caitlin Lusk doing the singing and the orchestra that was doing those live concerts, and it's just really great to have that token of that experience, even if it wasn't the same, concert, but it retains, it brings back those memories when I listen to it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful time. I'm hoping that, as I say, that some of these things can start up again when all concerts can start up again, which of course we're all incredibly hopeful for, either as participants or as viewers or what have you. But it'll be nice.
Okay, so let's switch gears and go into the world of let's do the world of men and talk about Rohan.
Okay.
Because I still remember sitting in the theaters in Two Towers, and when Gandalf releases Theoden from Saruman's spell, and that music just takes over, and the fiddle is playing, and I remember I went back into, I had seen something else one time when I was at the movies, and I snuck into Two Towers for a couple of minutes afterwards, and it was just my luck. It was right at that point, and I just stood there. I was like, I'm not moving. I'll just stay here till the scene's over.
Okay.
I mean, I don't even know really where to start, but just talk about that music and everything that's sort of involved in the theme.
Well, he wanted to create something. It was sort of portrayed as as almost Viking-like element to that culture, which was sort of inspired by Tolkien's own approach. Tolkien was a student of things like Fourth Erlingus. Yes, exactly. He did his own translation of Beowulf and things like that. So that's sort of that time period and some of those European elements and all of that. And Howard wanted to create a score or a theme, I should say, that felt proud but also on hard times, which I think was it was very, created a very emotional response in many people. I think much in the way that there was a huge resonance at that time of we were shortly after the events of September 11th, things like that. And I know there was a lot of talk in the scene in Moria where, so do all who live to see such times and all that sort of thing, where Gandalf speaks with Frodo about living through hard times and deciding how to handle them. And I think there was a lot of that in the air of seeing, and I say this as we're going through another hard time in the world's history, but post September 11th, I think people felt a lot in those passages. So I think there was a very strong element of that fallen grandeur element in the Rohan theme, that it was a once proud culture that had sort of fallen apart, or at least was suffering at the moment. And I think that was what he was most trying to portray. And it's, to see any element of like that, any story element like that, where there's beauty, but it's suffering. It's a very potent thing, I think. So I think that's largely what he was going for.
Yeah, and I'm just in love with the way that theme has sort of different elements. It's the Eowyn and Theoden theme is so beautiful, and it was interesting going back and reading the book, and that Howard considers that to be Eowyn and Theoden's theme, because it's played a lot with Eowyn. So I had thought, is that just her theme? But that
Eowyn has a lot of themes, but a lot of them are also relationship themes. She has her own little motif, which of course you hear for the I am no man scene in Return of the King. But she has a lot of relationship themes as well. She's an interesting character because she's such a strong character in her own right, but she influences a lot of characters around her. So he chose to sort of show a very multifaceted character. She might be the individual. I think now that I say this, but she might be the individual in the Lord of the Rings scores that has the most thematic material. as far as a character, because she has a number. They're not very long themes; they're almost motivic, but she does have a lot of thematic material. Gollum has a couple, but again, since most of these themes tend to be cultural, there's not a lot of individual character themes, so she really gets a lot.
And it really, and this is not to say that I don't like the the different approach of the Hobbit scores, but there's just something again that adds to this feeling of this being an old tale, having these themes being mostly centered around cultures,
mm-hmm.
and it's just I am getting repetitive. I just
that's it. I mean, the map is a very
done.
important part of this storytelling. In Lord of the Rings, especially because you have to kind of figure out where are these forces coming from and how are they, who's allies and who are enemies and things like that. So the music represents that map in a way. You can see, and again, this goes back to the idea of these scores being so complete. You can tell where characters come from on the music. You can hear, thematic elements of different plots on the map of Middle Earth. If you're from the eastern part of Middle Earth, you have these type of sounds. If you're from the southern part of Middle Earth, you have these type of instruments and sounds. And that works with the timeline too. You can sort of tell what era is being referenced in Middle Earth by the harmonic language and things like that as well. The older era of Middle Earth was much more chromatic in Howard's score. So if you hear some of these stretched intervals, those represent older things. The elves have some of those things. The men do not. The men have more, third age type of writing. So yeah, all these things are hugely important. The history of these things and the direction and the places. That's why it was such an anthropological effort in a way, Hey, there's Cliff. Hey, Cliff. Good to see you.
Cliff was on here for talking about the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance a few weeks ago.
No kidding. Wonderful.
If anybody here who hasn't seen that chat, go check it out. We had a great time. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's good to see Cliff. But that's how the storytelling was done. The Hobbit stories are less based on that type of information. There's not as many groups moving from here to there that you need to sort of keep track of in that way. It's more geographically contained in a way. I'm coming up with a lot of strange phrases tonight. There's not so much. It's a smaller chunk of the map. It is consistent with what happened in Lord of the Rings, with Smaug's theme, Smaug being an ancient element and an element more of the eastern areas in Middle Earth. Has the same sort of harmonic language that you would hear with Mordor and places like that. And being an older element too.
Yeah, well, we certainly won't have the time to jump into all the great stuff in the Hobbit stories. I do have to say, Smaug's theme, just when I first heard that soundtrack, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. Just the instruments being used, and it's so creepy and exotic and dangerous.
Those were a huge amount of fun for me, because at that point I didn't have to prove myself of like who's the little guy hanging around the edge of the orchestra. They were able to just kind of throw me in because the book was out and people knew where I was. So I was able to do much more, the fly on the wall the entire time with the Hobbit scores, and that was great fun for those reasons as well. As I say, anytime I go back to these films or these scores, it's a very personal thing, because you remember where you were in your life. The video blog that we did for the Desolation of Smaug, we would have filmed that 7 years ago next week, because that was on my birthday. So they, when we weren't on camera talking about the score, they had gotten a cake, and it was a wonderful experience. So these things are all kind of, I'm not trying to turn everything around to be about me, but just in terms of my own memories, it's a very special thing.
If I had had the experience you had, I would totally make it all about me. No. And there's also another bit of music that I want to talk about that's not, strictly Rohan music, but it is related to Theoden and well, it's not entirely related to them, but it does show up for them. It's the piece of music that plays during Boromir's death.
Mm.
And then it recurs when Theoden and Eowyn are saying goodbye, not quite for the last time, but
Almost, yeah.
before battle. And I find it really interesting that because that music plays first when Boromir's killed, and then when we flash back to that, and then it's brought back for that Eowyn and Theoden scene. Can you talk about what Howard's ideas were there for that?
Well, I mean, obviously, it is a premonition of death. I think one of the stories that stands out to me the most is that he was wondering if people would notice that. He knew that he had done a very subtle statement of it there. But this was by the time of Return of the King. He was sort of all in for thematic subtlety and references and what else can I do with these themes? That's sort of a non-linear approach to some of these things. So there's little things like that are very fleeting and very subtle, and once you get them, incredibly meaningful. There's that gorgeous rendition of what we call the Silver Trumpets theme, which is sort of Gondor's B theme. I think it's only in the extended edition of the film and the score, but where you see the fallen statue with the head off of it in Return of the King and the crown of flowers. You had a little glimpse of that Silver Trumpets theme of Gondor to sort of, again, the idea of fallen beauty of the once powerful Gondor being reduced to, this sort of very, very tenuous kingdom. Happy birthday, thanks.
And thank you, Matthew. Again, I'm just delighted to see the number of people in here. This is great, guys. Thank you all for coming. And speaking of Gondor, let's talk about that because, and you were just talking about subtlety and the fact that that moment of bringing the theme back for Eowyn and Theoden did go over my head. But reading your book illuminated that, and then when I went back to look at it, I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. Right. And sort of on that subject, I'm sure I didn't notice that there was any type of theme playing when Boromir stands up at the Council of Elrond. And someone may have pointed out to me, before Two Towers, the extended cut of Two Towers came around. I'm not sure. But I know that especially it became a big thing when the trailer for Return of the King came out, and there was that specially composed piece of music that had this theme just flourishing. And then you look at where it starts with this little hint of a theme in that moment. And it's just that type of thing is mind-boggling to me, especially because I know that there was this ridiculous impression when that I heard from some people when the soundtrack first came out for the first film that they didn't think that the movie had themes, which is kind of ridiculous. But I think it's because, usually a lot of movies have like a big major theme that's sort of in your face, and right. Fellowship was so layered with an enormous amount of themes. But then to see something that was a bit more subtle planted in that score become this big, huge theme that, you get Gandalf and Pippin riding into Minas Tirith. That whole sequence is so beautiful.
Right. Yeah, it was a more maybe nuanced approach to using some of these themes. It was probably closer to closer to classical models than to showbiz models, so to speak. Which I'm kind of feel like I'm insulting the traditions of film music, which of course came out of classical music, but it harkened back to earlier, less. The themes in The Lord of the Rings, ironically, were not designed to sell records. They were designed to tell a story. It ended up that they sold a heck of a lot of records, but that's because they were wonderful themes, and once they once they kind of got under your skin, they were unforgettable. But they took some getting there, which made your connection to them all that much stronger. I think they weren't, primed for, radio play necessarily. There's not like a concert version of the Fellowship theme where it has a beginning and then a B section and then a finale. It's a very mature theme that exists as part of a larger tapestry, and that's what they're trying to create. So it's a different type of thematic writing, but I think it's more. I don't know. You form a more deeper connection with them because of that, I think.
Yeah, because even on like the soundtracks for Two Towers and Return of the King, you've got tracks like The Riders of Rohan, and then in Return of the King, Minas Tirith, but they're not really like concert pieces of a theme. They're sort of stitched together from different elements of the score, and so I mean, those pieces are fantastic, and I play them all the time, but they're not what you would traditionally think is like, oh, this is the track that's such and such theme.
Yeah, they don't have sort of like a concert form per se. Yeah, they're almost a sort of essay on a certain thematic nugget and mood in a way.
And so, and Gondor has a couple different elements. You've got the and now I'm just, as I say that, I'm thinking about all the different, parts to the music. But there's the, the main Gondor theme. Then you have a theme from Minas Tirith, and then eventually it all leads to Gondor Reborn.
Right.
Can you just sort of, go through those themes and talk a little bit about the development?
Well, the main Gondor theme is the one that is hinted at in Fellowship and in the Two Towers, and it was I think I decided to push the boundaries of what I thought I could get away with. So part of our initial discussions on these scores, Howard and I would sit and watch the films together, and we would schedule a day sometime this spring where we would watch the theatrical version, and then I would come back later in the year, I think in the fall, I guess, and we'd watch the extended edition and that sort of thing. But at the time that we watched Fellowship of the Ring together, when Boromir stood up and there was that beautiful French horn theme, I decided to be a little cheeky and say, that would probably be a good theme for Gondor down the line. And Howard just sort of chuckled, okay, sure. And then for a while I was convinced, well, I talked him into it. I came up with the Gondor theme. And then I went back and found all these early sketches where the Gondor theme was like in the prologue, and it was, with the Argonath and all that. So he'd been thinking on it along. I just sort of figured
I'll hear nothing about that. You're responsible, dog.
I know. I was very disappointed that I hadn't come up with the Gondor theme. But it's a beautiful, the themes for mankind tend to be more contemporary even to our ears. They have larger intervallic stretches. They're very brass based. They feel more connected with the type of what we think of as thematic writing in the 21st century, I suppose. So Gondor starts with that big, beautiful open fifth. That's sort of a that flat seven on top because it is sort of contemporary sound as it goes up. But that is the principal Gondor theme. It has a rising phrase, and then there's two different endings to the theme. One of them sort of collapses back to where the theme began from, which is Gondor in decline. So it's really Gondor on hard times. Again, a recurring concept in these stories and in these scores. But then there's also Gondor in ascension, which does show that it eventually goes on to reclaim its former glory. And it literally, the phrase continues to ascend. It's a rising figure, which is also connected to Aragorn's theme, which is itself connected to the Fellowship theme. So it's sort of how the Fellowship theme influences Aragorn's theme, and how Aragorn's theme then goes on to influence a new concluding phrase for the Gondor theme, which shows how everything really, really fits together beautifully in that narrative.
That kind of blew my mind.
It's pretty cool.
When I remember being on like the message boards and people were like dissecting parts of the music, and
Cool.
You can hear the Aragorn music here and the way it was all fitting together. And I mean that's what makes these scores so brilliant. You know, just the fact that it would be enough that they sound as amazing as they do, but there's so many great ideas behind them.
People forget that too. It's a wonderful point that you could put all of these intricate narrative ideas into a really annoying sounding score. Like these themselves do not create a beautiful and moving score. So the fact that it is both beautiful and moving, and then also intricately structured, I mean, it's nothing short of a small miracle. But anyway, so that's the principal Gondor theme. There's a secondary Gondor theme, which was the one I was talking about before, the Silver Trumpets theme, which shows a softer side to Gondor, and sort of more the beauty in the way that Boromir remembers it. So it is the theme that you hear when Boromir speaks of the beauty of Gondor when they're in Lothlorien. And then you hear it again several spots, but the spot I was mentioning with the fallen statue, the fallen head, and the crown of flowers and all that. And it's a beautiful, again, a brass theme with larger intervals to it. So a more contemporary theme, more pushing toward the future or the contemporary elements of the storytelling. And then when you get to the end of the Return of the King and you finally have defeated Sauron and all that, as they sort of usher in the fourth age of Middle Earth, everything becomes a new theme. So you have the Gondor Reborn theme, which sort of takes these, the language of Gondor's music and reinvents it for a new fourth age theme, which happens. The Shire has all new themes too. There's sort of like this whole new collection of themes that comes in at the end of the story, which is a really bold choice. People give Return of the King a lot of grief about how the last bit of that film is structured. And of course, people can have their own opinions on that. But I think the score makes such an interesting and unusual choice to reinvent itself at that point and kind of step into the new world. And then kind of pulls that back a little bit as you see the characters that weren't so successful, like Frodo and Bilbo weren't so successful moving into the fourth age of Middle Earth, and still sort of have figuratively and literally the old wounds of the third age that prevent them from moving forward. So you kind of get that clash of thematic material. Originally, Return of the King ended with a big statement of the Fellowship theme. It was going to be the Fellowship theme played on more sort of like a Hobbity setting, and it was almost too much of a push back into the third age of Middle Earth. The storytelling kind of went back.
That was actually a thought that I had as I was reading your book, and you write about how it's sort of all about pushing forward.
Yeah,
and the fact that I remembered back to the Rarity version, which does the Fellowship theme, and then I thought to myself, I wonder if they didn't go for that because it was more reflective as opposed to pushing forward. And so it's exciting to hear you say that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes the end of these stories so beautiful is that it's a reminder that life only moves in one direction. As much as we remember things, you either move forward with your life and move forward with the story of our own lives, or you kind of sink under the weight of your own resistance or your own memories. And it's kind of the idea of Frodo and Bilbo not being able to move forward. They have to stop where they are. They've hit the end of their stories, and they're not still developing into the fourth age. And I think there's something, really reflectively beautiful about the fact that the world is always reinventing itself, and we do either move forward or get stuck in place. And so the music did the same thing. And if they had made the choice to quote the Fellowship theme there, it was very interestingly done musically, pretty cool, but it also went back to it wasn't telling the story, it was lowering the curtain. It was a conceit of theater rather than a conceit of sort of narrative honesty. So they went with the narrative honesty, and I think that was a cool thing. It makes it very meaningful. You know, when we finally got the book released in 2010, we did our book signings and some lectures around town, and went to some of the wonderful music schools in London. And then we did the presentation of The Return of the King at Royal Albert, and you know, they gave us the Queen's box, and we sat there and watched it. And by this time, I can't even tell you how many times I'd seen these films and listened to these scores. But this time, when we got to the end of The Return of the King, I have to admit, I started to tear up, despite the fact that I'd seen the thing and heard the thing dozens and dozens of times. But it was a reminder that you've done this thing now, and you have the totality of this adventure, and now you're moving on to something else. And you know, remembering that life goes forward, you know. So it has a very beautiful and human meaning to it, and I think maybe that's why, you know, I'm clearly not the only one that these stories have moved. So I think that's why a lot of people find this so meaningful.
I'm reminded of a moment of Sir Ian in the documentaries when, you know, sort of summing up the experience, and he takes like this deep breath and goes, whew, that was a journey worth going on, you know. Yeah. And that's, you know, exactly what it feels like. And so I think it is right that the films end sort of moving in that forward direction. And I'm just realizing that structurally this would have been a great topic to conclude on, but I can't possibly not talk about some of the elves' music, because we haven't covered that. But just, I mean, not just the Rivendell theme, and then, you know, we talked earlier about the Lothlorien music, which is very kind of, you know, almost you know, it's exotic, it starts off kind of unwelcoming, but then you've also got you know, several themes, you know, related to Arwen. And again, reading your book, I didn't notice that. I mean, maybe I did subconsciously, but I didn't think about it. It's where that music that you hear when, you know, we first see her, then is saved and comes back when she's revealed at the end of Return of the King to Aragorn. And the fact that I always thought that the piece we hear when she has her vision in Return of the King was a wholly new piece, but reading your book, it's connected. It is the Evenstar material from Two Towers, but just, you know, slightly different. So I guess we can start with the Rivendell music.
Sure.
When I first listened to that music, it was like before I even saw the film, and usually when I see a film is when I really fall in love with the music, because it sort of is given context then. But right off the bat, you listen to that Rivendell music, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So can you just sort of talk about what Howard was trying to do with that music?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the idea of ancient elements in Middle-earth being slightly more chromatic. So he's basically taking two major chords, a minor third, apart from each other, right? If I remember, at least at some point, I believe he's moving back and forth between F major and D major. But he arpeggiates the chord and then has like a flat sixth on top. So it'd be like F, A, C, D flat, C, A, F, and then D, F sharp, A, B flat, A, F sharp, D, which is a lot of analytical mumbo jumbo to just say that they're very chromatic. They don't just sit on the white notes of the piano and do something, you know, very simplistic or very pentatonic as say the Shire themes do. And this goes the idea of things that are older in Middle-earth have this sort of language to them. Rivendell has that, Mordor has that, Smaug has that in the Hobbit scores. But in this case, it's not just the ancient quality to it, but there's a sort of welcoming quality. It's a, you know, Howard sort of had his hierarchy of elf cultural elf music. I don't know, however you'd say it. But some of them are more friendly than others, and some of them are a little bit more off-putting. Lothlorien seems like it could be a little creepy, a little bit scary. But Rivendell is pretty inviting. It's a place of learning and of respite and of reading and of knowledge. And they maybe aren't hugely fond of other cultures, but they're welcoming of them. They're accepting of them. I mean, they raised Aragorn, so there was a warmth to that, in addition to that sort of exotic, harmonic color. Lothlorien, it is a little bit less comforting. It is based on a sort of a Western approximation of a Middle Eastern mode, Maqam Hijaz, which has a augmented interval, an augmented second interval, which is kind of what we've always used in Western music to approximate the more complicated harmonies that we often hear from the Middle East. Some of these beautiful sounds. It uses the monochord, which is a kind of a giant instrument with one string stretched all the way across it, that's used. It has therapeutic purposes originally. You sort of lay across it, and they'd strum this thing, and it would cure your ills and things like that. But it's a not a not a dark theme, not an angry theme, nothing like that, but it has a little bit of mystery to it. It's not quite as embracing as the Rivendell theme. And then, of course, Howard took that to the next level with the Woodland Elves and the Hobbit, where they are, fairly antagonistic characters. So that those themes got a little bit more exotic, a little bit more threatening. But that's how those things were sort of structured, and I think he liked to do that, where it helped him draw some of the character of these themes into focus by having other themes to compare them to. It also created a necessity for them. How do you create a sort of shortcut for audiences to understand that the elves of Rivendell and the elves of Lothlorien have a different disposition? Well, make their music sound a little bit different. We understand those characters so quickly when you hear their music. That's how we understand people in real life. We know the music of different parts of the world, and it helps us understand the aesthetics of different places, and it's a great human way for understanding things.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the Lothlorien music is the way it evolves over the course of the films, because by the time you get to Return of the King and you have the vision with Galadriel, the Lothlorien theme and the look of Galadriel and the forest and that Frodo's scene is just completely different from the more intimidating vision of it that we have.
Yeah, it's a little creepy the first time you hear it, but then when it comes back again, compared to the music you're hearing in Shaleb's lair, you're really happy to hear the Lothlorien theme come back. It's a lot more comforting when you compare it to the creepy spider music, right?
Which, yeah, and we didn't even talk about the music for the monsters of Middle Earth, because there was a line in your book that Howard said about the Watcher and the water, about how it's science fiction basically.
Right. Yeah.
And I just liked that, because the music is kind of it's chaotic in a way that a lot of the rest of the score isn't.
Yeah, it's a technique that he uses all throughout the scores, which is aleatoric writing, essentially giving instructions to the players to let them improvise within a certain set of parameters. So you can use these pitches and these types of rhythms, and you do it for this amount of time or this number of bars. And it creates a very... again, this goes to the idea of not wanting to write scores that sound too contemporary. If you fill in with a lot of counterpoint where it's very strictly structured in a European sense, it starts to sound like the music of the modern world, the real world. Aleatoric music fills in that textural complexity, but it does it in a sort of nonlinear, non-structured way, and lets it feel a little bit more otherworldly. For The Watcher and the Water, he took that technique to its extreme and kind of had the entire orchestra doing these rambling, noodly figures on everything, which was really reminiscent of the the Watcher's tentacles and the water splashing everywhere and all the physical presence of that. And then, of course, he layers on top of that some of those brass figures that are, building into little dissonances on top of these nasty little swirls of everybody improvising all at the same time. But it creates a very specific sound for that creature and for that moment that it really doesn't come back anywhere in the score that prominently. Howard did an amazing score based almost entirely on that type of writing for it's a Jennifer Lopez film called The Cell. And I don't think I've seen the film but once, but it was where he kind of first worked with some of the instruments that showed up in Lord of the Rings, some of those techniques and stuff. And it's a really amazing, unusual score, really quite beautiful in its own way. But that's a device he likes to use in a lot of his scores, that aleatoric writing. It's a very unique 20th century device for making things sound ancient.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about Shelob over much because there are some people watching this who don't like even the mention of spiders.
Okay. I think Peter Jackson has the same affliction, doesn't he?
Yeah,
he got a little phobia.
Which is hilarious that, and here I go, I'm talking about Shelob, but the fact that he made such, a terrifying spider, and, he's certainly the authority on that.
Yeah, well, Howard's written music for flies, so why not spiders? He's good at insect music, I think.
Yeah, the strings in that section of the film, and how, again, the word that comes to mind is chaotic, and
it's a different type of chaos. It's more structured, more rhythmic. Howard's dealing with some almost a serial technique. So the music students in the audience will know that from 12-tone music and dodecaphonic music and things like that. The second Viennese school, where you sort of do a set of pitches and repeat them and develop them. And ironically, I think Howard's using an 8-note set of pitches here, so very appropriate for a spider. But yeah, it's very creepy. It's very creepy.
Yeah, let me try and work my way through the last couple things I want to talk about since we are going on. But continue on with the elves. The Even Star theme. It's a lot of that music for Arwen, especially, and in the Two Towers. There's moments, and this goes to the cinematography, Peter Jackson's direction, and as well as the music. There are moments where you've got like Arwen's veil kind of blowing in the wind, and the way the music seems to accentuate that, and it's pure poetry, and just watching that. And I don't know how Howard's able to do that and make that, because it becomes something more than just hearing great music and seeing great pictures. The way they work in tandem, it's just like looking at a beautiful piece of art. And
well, the art was incredibly important in the film. Alan Lee and John Howe were such incredible artists and designers for all of this. They kind of granted us access to their archives for the book as well, and both absolutely proper gentlemen, just wonderful to work with. And I mean, people who are looking at the background behind us right now, that's the work that we're referring to. These incredible pencil, you want to call them sketches, but they're far more developed and intricate than that. But yeah, it's the type of stuff that Howard found very inspiring too. It's just the look of all these things and the careful motion. Andrew Lesnie's amazing cinematography, dearly departed Andrew. But the beauty of film music is that it functions in tandem with the imagery and becomes something more. And I think that fact was certainly not lost on Howard. I think he found a lot of things incredibly inspiring. The visuals on these films are, they've never really been seen before in this way. This sort of incredibly historic approach to fantasy. The fact that they would put the dirt of the location under the actors' fingernails before they started to shoot, so that everybody looked like they were really there, really part of this environment. it's a far cry from Prince Valiant and things like that of yesteryear, where it was much more studio bound and very designed. These things felt so natural.
And I've neglected to talk about this yet, but since we're talking about the artwork that's displayed up, and Aaron will absolutely kill me if I don't bring it up, the music for the Dwardelf.
Yeah,
that moment chills down my spine. Just
and it's great live too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Every time Ludwig conducts that, it gets a little bit bigger. It's you could just wait every single show you see. He's taking that up a few decibels. It's an absolutely gorgeous moment, and it feels as if narratively that's not an important moment. There's nothing that like you have to know that Dwardelf is great or you don't understand the rest of the story. You know what I mean? It's like a incredibly important structural beat to show you this world, and it's part of the reason that you feel like Middle Earth is a leading character in these films, because you could have cut that out and the storytelling would still be the same. There's nothing like, and then because Dwardelf was so great, they were able to, whatever. It's not a story element. It's a moment of beauty and repose. And you need it at that point because you've been in the dark for so long. They made the choice that once you go into Moria, you're not going to leave. You're going to stay in that part of the story. You're not going to cut away to something else. You want that claustrophobia. But yeah, happy birthday, Christopher Tolkien. Absolutely. But it's a way to get a moment of light and beauty into the score without taking you out of that story. So I mean, yeah, what an absolutely gorgeous moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so great. There are moments in these films that you could argue you maybe wouldn't need narratively, and there are moments where the score is allowed to unleash on these incredible visuals. I mean, going back to talk about the Gondor theme, although this is a narratively a sort of important moment, but when we just get the lighting of the beacons, and it's just pure music and visuals for a couple minutes, and that's moments like that are just some of the most beautiful in the trilogy.
Right. Well, I mean, music is such an important element in the mythology of Middle Earth. So to do something where music was never able to take a driver's seat, it would have been a shame, and it would have been it wouldn't have done Tolkien's work a true service to do that. So I think that's very important. Yeah.
And I think there was there's another theme I wanted to talk about, and this will probably be one of the last ones because I could, certainly keep going on and on and on, but at a certain point we run out of time. It's the fate of the ring, which is, plays over. You get hints of it when Gandalf and Aragorn are talking in the extended cut of Two Towers.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, something that comes back and forth as, Sauron is destroyed, and it's this big, enormous moment. And again, it's one of those moments where Howard plants the seeds of something that are
he's very careful. It's more of a shape than a long form tune, if you take my meaning. So it's very easy, or it's very appropriate to state it subtly and sort of in a fractional form, and then let it blossom later on. If it had been a sort of 8-measure melody or something, you never could have done that sort of a thing, or at least you would have showed your hand quite obviously. You'd have to suddenly launch into this big glorious tune in the middle of a dark scene, and then it comes back a few hours later. So the subtlety with which he did these things is amazing, and I think it goes to his musical language, the way he likes to use these. To him, contour is as important as a long musical line. So the fate of the ring, the fellowship theme, that there and back again shape, things like that. Like they're all over the scores, but they're so subtle, and it allows him to, keep that momentum to everything, keep that eyes forward on his storytelling, rather than kind of, now we're going to do this, now we're going to do it. It doesn't never feel piecemeal. It feels like a long, it feels like 12 hours of music essentially if you play the whole thing back to back to back. And I think that's why I say, like, Howard had his own approach to leitmotivic writing, to thematic writing, and boy, am I glad he did, because he just found the perfect way to make these things, when they need to take the driver's seat, they can, and when they need to sort of just poke up their head from the corners and go, hey, I'm an element, they can do that too. They're so carefully constructed.
And actually, there is a theme which I hadn't gotten to yet, which is the perfect one to sort of close out our thematic discussion, which is in the theme for Into the West.
Yeah.
And it's a theme that doesn't appear until Return of the King, with that moment with Gandalf and Pippin. But you wrote something very interesting in the book, which wasn't necessarily apparent to me, that sort of there's a bit of it woven throughout the fabric of the entire score. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
It's another gestural thing, where that kind of, circular shape in a way, which I think is very appropriate for a movie with the rings in the title. But that shape kind of shows up a lot, and it never takes on any particular connection to the drama. It doesn't represent anything as specific. It's just sort of a part of the fabric of that world. It isn't referencing anything until it's brought into that discussion with Gandalf, where it's directly referencing the Grey Havens at that point, and the Undying Lands and all that. But it's kind of like he it was almost Howard realizing his own fingerprint there, and taking ownership over it, finding a tendency that he had in those scores, and then just sort of giving it direction as time went on. And then, it becomes that final song, that beautiful Annie Lennox song. And yeah, it's a hard piece to hear without kind of getting choked up. That's probably about the moment where I started to get the sniffles at that last performance of Return of the King, when we finally got the book released.
Yeah, my tears don't ever, not well up with Into the West. And I think part of it is, it's every time I watch the ending of that film, and when that music comes in and you see all the gorgeous Alan Lee portraits of the actors and everything, it just brings back that flood of memories of the experience of seeing that film and getting to the end of it, because it was like this, as you say, for a couple of years there, it just felt like we were all in Lord of the Rings world.
It's interesting to me, and I don't know if it's the way the stories are told, or the way the scores fill in so much of the history or whatever. But by today's standards, the Lord of the Rings movies, this whole project, this whole phenomenon, didn't take all that long to get out. I mean, you have the Harry Potter series, you have the Marvel movies, you have the Star Wars movies that have been coming out for 40 years and things like that. Somehow it feels like the Lord of the Rings project took more time than it did. Like it made a deeper crater than some of those other ones did. And I don't know why, if it's because it has a deeper resonance as a story, if it's because it's a much more complete mythology, if it's because the mythology is better thought out, because it all existed before they started trying to make films out of everything. But somehow it feels like it took a long time. It took a lot of temporal real estate. It was only 3 years. 01, 02, 03. That was it. 1, 2, 3. But I don't know. Maybe that's just me, because I was still in Middle Earth for the next 7 years trying to get the book done. But somehow it has a sort of resonance that I think it's still going today. And as I kind of hinted at before, it took on very specific worldly meaning in 2001 because of the events that were happening right then. And I think maybe a lot of people have returned to those stories in 2020 because we've had a rough year. We've had a hard time with things, and I think the themes of caring for one another, of perseverance, of putting the greater good ahead of our own, of trying to learn from our history, of trying to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps when things are difficult, of the importance of music and the arts that become especially relevant and important when perhaps we're denied them a little bit in concert halls and in movie theaters and things like that. I think maybe I've done more Lord of the Rings interviews this year than I've done maybe in the past 3, 4, 5 years, because I think these stories and these scores speak to us in hard times, and I think maybe take on a little bit extra weight and extra beauty, and to help to remind us why we keep trying to move forward. Like I said, the eyes forward, keep going, and we've had a rough year and we're trying to get things better. And I think we used to always refer to these as fourth quarter projects. People like them in November, December, January. We'd get into that last bit of the year and people really found something very special in these stories and in these scores. That's why we always try to release even the albums and the books. We made them fourth quarter projects. It was like Tolkien time, and we've had an entire year that feels like the fourth quarter of something else. We've been stuck inside and having hard times and seeing a lot of difficult times in the world. So I think they're really speaking to everybody right now, and I hope that we learn our lessons from them and remember what's important in our lives. I think they're good for that.
And I could not think of a better way to close out the discussion. Well said, sir. And
thank you.
Yeah, and it's fitting that these movies just resonate more and more as time goes on. Now, I do want to finish off by what's actually nice is we went through and we talked about the concerts and stuff throughout the stream, so I don't have to worry about cramming that stuff in at the end. But so I can just move on to a very quick query about something Hobbit related. I've heard whispers about that there might be another book coming. What information is there?
Well, I don't have any new updates, but I give you the same update that I gave the last time I gave an update, which is yes, I did shortly after the Hobbit scores were completed. In fact, within a few months after that, we did do a Music of the Hobbit Films book. It's currently unreleased. In fact, it's sitting on the same computer I'm talking to you on right now. But yeah, it'd be nice to get that out at some point. We'll see what'll happen. I certainly would be more than thrilled to show off some of the incredible forethought and subtleties that went into these 3 scores by Howard Shore as well. They're different types of scores. They're more contemporary in feel, I think, but they're incredibly well structured and connected to the Lord of the Rings scores. So it'd be lovely to show that off at some point. We'll see. We used to always have this joke that everything in Middle Earth took about 7 times longer than it took in any other property. So everything you do that's connected with Middle Earth properties just seems like it takes a long time. I think the people trying to make the Amazon show right now are finding the same thing to be true. Nothing happens quickly in Middle Earth. I'm not sure why. So yeah, we'd love to get that book out at some point, but we'll see what's in the cards. I hope so. Either that or I'll just do like a really long live stream where I read the whole thing out loud to everybody. That will be if you have 34 hours to kill, tune in.
I think there would be plenty of happy people. And obviously I already know the answer to this one, that it's probably more of a hope than anything right now. But I will say that I would absolutely die to have as great as the existing soundtracks are, complete recordings with all the music for the Hobbit films.
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of people would like them. I think a lot would.
But since you are doing a book, just saying, if you wanted to throw another rarities disc in there and throw some of that missing stuff on there.
Yeah.
Eagle music from An Unexpected Journey.
Well, I mean, like I said before, these projects seem like they never go out of style. They are true evergreens. There's always somebody interested in these. So as long as there's interest, there's always a possibility. So it might be 10 years from now, might be, I might get a call next week. I think Howard and I have we're doing an NPR thing at some point in the next couple of weeks, I think. So maybe he'll surprise me at the end of it going, hey, you know what we should do?
Excellent.
You never know. You never know.
And I do. There were just a couple questions from people that I neglected to ask during, so I'm just going to ask those real quick, and then we can wrap up. From a nice fellow on Twitter named Mohammed Osman. He said, were there any particular fantasy or epic film scores that Mr. Shore was inspired by when creating the Lord of the Rings music? Perhaps a film that he grew up with that may have served as a reference point. Thanks.
I think part of the reason that these scores sound so fresh and so unique is because he didn't have a sort of a model that he was following with them. I don't think he had anything that particularly inspired him other than Tolkien's writing. He discovered Tolkien's writing as a young man. Howard played in a rock band and used to open for Jimi Hendrix and things like that. So we spent a lot of time on the road, and I think read this, Tolkien's writings in the 60s, as a lot of young people did at that time. And I think more than anything, that's was his inspiration, was trying to recreate Tolkien's world in music. So I don't think he was inspired by any other score necessarily. No.
Okay.
Which I think was rather great. I think that was a big plus for him.
Yeah. And I have another question from Erin. Her question is about sort of the terms that you used when writing the book. And she wants to know a little bit more about the editorializing side of the process, where you ascribe specific emotions to certain themes, like this theme is less certain and more pleading. For those well-trained in music, are those sorts of things objective? Could someone else well-trained in music hear something different than pleading? Is the process of ascribing emotions easier after a discussion with Howard Shore about what he was going for?
That's a great question, and she's gotten right to the heart of it. That yes, I tried to never ascribe any meaning to a theme, whether it be an individual statement of a theme or the overall concept of a theme, without running it by Howard. Even the technicalities of things, I'd run everything by Howard, and that's why I don't think I would ever want to do a project like this or anything like that without being able to work hand in hand with the creator. That was hugely important to me. I used to say to people that when I was working on this book that I felt in many ways like a performer tasked with playing someone's great work. That it was my interpretation of it. It was my statement of it, but it was their music. It was their creation. I was just trying to bring it to life in a way. So all of these things, I wanted to make sure that this is indeed what Howard intended. And there were times where, most of the time, I think we were pretty well in lockstep with things. I got to really understand his mindset as best as I could. But there were times on occasion where I said, that's not really what I was thinking there, or I really did this, for a different reason than you were thinking I did. And I was hugely thankful for that, because I wanted to make sure that I could, stand atop this work when it was done and say, you may love it, you may hate it, but it's honest. It is accurate. What a gift to be able to do something like that with the composer looking over your shoulder and not telling me, say this part's great or anything like that. I wasn't trying to put words in my mouth, but he understood that it was important to me that everything be right, that it really represent his intentions in all ways. So to have that as a possibility is a huge gift. And, that's a time commitment for a very important, very busy composer. So it was it was lovely. Yet another reason that Howard Shore is an absolute gem of human being. He's just very kind, and he cares. He really cares. He wants things to be done well, and he wants people to be happy with what they're creating. Incredibly supportive.
And it's fitting that my Here Be Dragons co-host Stephen would insert himself to the very end of this. So I have some of his questions for you, and then we'll be wrapped up. What was your relationship with Tolkien's works before the films?
I knew them. I'd read them. To be honest, I think my very first exposure was probably the Hobbit cartoon when I was a little kid. He used to come on TV. It seems like it was in the spring a lot. I seem to remember it being like, as a little kid, lament. You always like to watch like the Christmas specials and stuff, and I'd always be mad that there weren't any like, a lot of like Easter shows made for little kids. But somehow the Hobbit kept coming on. But I think it took me like, I was probably like 10 years old before I finished it because it scared me. Gollum was horrifying to a little kid.
Yes,
I couldn't get through that thing.
I actually did a whole stream about that animated film, and needless to say, I think I was the only genuine fan of it. But Gollum, yeah, it's like I was terrified of Gollum, and that carried over to when I read the books.
I got a comment here about Cat, Dragon, Smaug. Yeah, I think the farthest I made it without finishing it was I got to the point where like Smaug showed up and he had that big mane and it creeped me out, so I couldn't finish the show. But I eventually finished it after the years. But I think that was my first exposure. And then, like most people, you read the Hobbit. I think I did the Hobbit before. I think I read Lord of the Rings before I read the Hobbit, to be honest with you. I think I kind of did them out of order. I'd seen the Hobbit in animated form, so I guess I felt I had a grasp on it. But that was my first exposure. I wasn't, some people are really, they read it religiously and really go through it. And maybe I was just young enough that I hadn't physically had the time to do that. But I wasn't obsessed with it in that way. It was something that I loved and paid attention to, but I don't think I really studied it with a more analytical eye until I got involved with all this. I think as soon as I signed on to all this, I decided I better get out Lord of the Rings again and check it out. So I think I did that just about as my first step. Howard and I had our first conversations in May of 2001, and I think before June I was back into the book thinking I remember who all these characters are. There's a lot of characters.
And I apologize for this question before I ask it. What was the original inspiration for Marvin the Paranoid Android?
Way back in my journalistic days, I got invited to watch them make an episode of The Simpsons by the composer. Alf Clausen was working on it. And I ended up sitting on the couch next to Matt Groening, watching them make an episode of The Simpsons. And he made the same joke as someone introduced him. This is Doug Adams. And he goes, oh, Hitchhiker's Guide, huh? And I think I tried to make some joke about, like, I'm not him, but I wish they'd send me his royalty checks or something like that. And I got... Never try to make a joke to the guy that invented The Simpsons because you're not going to be as funny as he is. So I just got a blank stare and he went back to making an episode of The Simpsons. So that's my Douglas Adams story. Although I should say the gentleman who laid out our book, The Music of the Lord of the Rings films, Gary Day Ellison, also did a lot of the layout work for Douglas Adams. So I think when I sent him the initial email saying, I've seen your work and would love it if you could maybe consider being a part of this project, I think I gave him a mild heart attack because he had worked with the other Douglas Adams who had passed away by this time. So he thought it was a voice from the beyond.
Let me see. Okay, and Stephen asks, I read somewhere that you're a band director. What is it about teaching music to kids that you enjoy the most?
I think teaching music to young people is incredibly similar to working with professionals at the highest level, places like the London Philharmonic and things like that, because the enthusiasm is so high. There's not a lot of, like, the jaded people seem to be in that sort of in-between stage. Young people are very enthusiastic about music, and professionals who are kind of living that dream are very enthusiastic about music. And I think the connection there is maybe that people, they care. I like to be around people who really are care. There's too much cynicism in this world already. I feel like I'm making a Sam Gamgee type of speech here, but there is too much cynicism in this world. and to find people that are unjaded and care and try and unafraid to put forth that effort. It's a fairly beautiful thing. So I try to surround myself by that as much as possible to hold my own jaded side at bay.
Okay, so we have two more. What would you consider an underrated film score?
An underrated film score by any composer?
Yep.
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I mean, there's a lot of underrated film composers these days. I would invite people to go find, if you like fantasy stuff that has a bit of a bittersweet element to it, find David Shire's Return to Oz. That's a beautiful score and very unusual. Anything by Toru Takemitsu, incredibly unusual to Western ears, but incredibly beautiful and moving. One of the other projects I've been working on for a few years, I mentioned that I did a little bit of work on Hugo, which led to a lot of discussions with Howard about the music of the silent film period. And so I did a book on that as well, which is another one that's sort of in the holding pattern.
I did want to ask.
Yeah. So we got Impossible Silence out there as well, but that one seems like it gets a little bit more motion every here and there. So hopefully that'll come out. But there's some wonderful scores from that period. If actually people should find, if you love Howard Shore's work in the Lord of the Rings, find Gottfried Hubert's scores to the Nibelungen, which is a two-part saga of the Nibelungen story by German production, and wonderful leitmotivic scores. And people always think the idea of writing leitmotifs in film kind of originated with Max Steiner and King Kong, but this was, I think the Nibelungen films were 26 or 27, I forget the exact year, but that predated 1933's Kong by a good number of years. So the idea of using leitmotivic writing in film came from a good while before that. So there's a couple composers that are probably not as well known, but there's great stuff. There's great stuff in, we talk about the sort of the weird way that concert music is programmed, that we kind of get the same, old white guy composers all the time. And there's a lot of beautiful music by other people from other backgrounds that I think people should make an effort to check out, because there's some incredible stuff out there. So that goes for film, that goes for concert hall, that goes for any style of music that you're interested in. Keep digging, because it's not just all the same names you see all the time.
And the final question, and I kind of wish this was mine, but credit goes to Stephen. Is there another film or series of films that you wish you could have covered in the same way as The Lord of the Rings?
I've been asked that, and they'll say, "Have you considered doing this one or doing this one or doing that one?" And there are other amazing series of scores out there. I don't know that anything would ever be as special as Lord of the Rings was and is. Both obvious, the most obvious reason being that I'm not sure anyone's done anything that meticulously thought out at any point. There's amazing music in a lot of films and a lot of series, things like that. But a lot of these things are created to the seat of their pants, and more typically Hollywood productions where you write film one, and then if that makes enough money, then you go and figure out how you're going to do with film two, and so on and so forth. I don't know that anything could ever mean as much to me as The Lord of the Rings, because at the time of my life in which it occurred, I was just coming out of music school and finding my way in the world, and traveling on my own and living on my own, and meeting my future wife, and all these sort of things. These kind of major life events all happened during my time in Middle Earth, so to speak. Now, it didn't hurt that I was there for about 12 years, so I guess you can fit a lot of living into that space of time. Yeah, I mean, if someone comes to me and says, "Can you do the music of the blah 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 films?" I'm not going to say no. These things are enormous fun to do, and maybe I'll find that doing them at this age, I'll have other wonderful life experiences that'll make them special for a whole other reason. But I don't know. I think I'd be too tempted to try to recreate what made and makes Lord of the Rings and my work with Howard Shore such a special thing to me. So maybe it's better to just leave things as they are and say, you started at the top, just leave it there.
Yeah, there's really, again, I'm not unbiased because I love these stories with a passion, and the films are, there's, I'm probably not going to win arguments if people try and talk objectively about what's the greatest film or film series, but for me,
Right.
Lord of the Rings holds such a special place in my heart that it is kind of the bar by which I tend to measure other things, and the store, that's the case with the store as well, and the store is an enormous reason for that. So your book is just again very important to me, and I want to thank you for writing it, and thank you for speaking with me. This did go on longer than I intended, so I apologize for that.
No,
Nobody in the audience is surprised though.
Well, thanks. I still see messages popping up on the right side here, so I'm thanks to everybody for hanging out. You guys made it. There was a 3-hour mark right there. There it was.
Yeah, and just want to tell everybody, this is Doug's book right here. So I put a link for it in the description. Go buy it. It's amazing. You won't regret it. And there's a CD included with some extra music that wasn't on the soundtracks for the films. So some early concepts and alternate versions and things. So definitely go ahead and get that. And just thank you all for sticking around. I had a fantastic time. Doug, it's been an honor, and thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you so much. Everybody be safe. Hang in there. Things are going to get better soon, I promise.
Oh, and real quick, since we're at the end, I'll just go ahead and say once again, tune in to see my co-host Amy on Here Be Dragons tomorrow. She'll be interviewed by Stephen Stark. And then join us next week. We'll have Jared returning to the stream, so it'll be the three members of the Knights of Kira to discuss the 2018 film Colette. And then for the 3 weeks after that, we'll just be talking Lord of the Rings nonstop with some guests. So if you're new here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can catch those. Thank you again, guys. I hope you all have a wonderful night, and thanks for watching.